Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a story that should be carved into every textbook about the American frontier, but it's been buried beneath decades of prairie romance and false promises. While millions of readers grew up believing in the gentle triumphs of the Little House books, the real story of Laura Ingalls Wilder and her husband Almanzo contains horrors that would shatter that carefully crafted myth. Between 1885 and 1889, 4 disasters struck this young couple with such brutal precision that their marriage should not have survived. Most didn't, but somehow they endured, though what remained of them was forever changed. This is the story of how the Dakota frontier devoured their dreams, one catastrophe at a time. The morning of August 25th, 1885, breaks clear and unremarkable over De Smet, Dakota territory. Inside the modest home of Reverend Edward Brown, 18-year-old Laura Elizabeth Ingalls stands in a black cashmere dress. Not white. Not the virginal symbol of new beginnings that tradition demands. Black cashmere. Practical. Sensible. The kind of dress that can be worn again and again because there is no money for luxuries like wedding gowns that serve no purpose beyond a single ceremony. Her hands are steady as she smooths the fabric. Across from her stands Almanzo James Wilder, 28 years old, a farmer with his own land claim and enough confidence to believe he can make a life out of the Dakota Prairie. He's 10 years her senior, a gap that matters less on the frontier where survival counts more than propriety. His hands bear the calluses of 6 years working his homestead north of town, breaking sod that has never known a plough, coaxing wheat from soil that the Lakota people knew better than to cultivate. The ceremony is brief. No crowd of well-wishers fills the parlour. No elaborate feast awaits. Laura's parents, Charles and Carolyn Ingalls, are present. Her sisters. A handful of witnesses whose names history has not preserved, because they do not matter to what follows. What matters is the moment when Reverend Brown reaches the traditional vows, and Laura, quiet, determined, stubborn, speaks words that will echo through her entire life. I will not say obey. It is not a shout, not a dramatic declaration of rebellion, simply a statement of fact. She will marry this man. She will work beside him, bear his children, share his name. But she will not promise obedience, will not surrender the autonomy she has guarded through years of teaching school, earning her own wages, making her own decisions. Almanzo does not argue. Perhaps he understands that the woman standing before him possesses a will as unyielding as the prairie itself. Perhaps he simply doesn't care about words when the work ahead will demand every ounce of strength they both possess. The vows are exchanged. They are married. And within an hour they climb into Almanzo's wagon and drive north toward the homestead that will become either their kingdom or their grave. The claim shanty sits on Almanzo's tree claim, 160 acres of additional land granted under the Timber Culture Act to settlers who promised to plant and cultivate trees on the treeless plains. The government, in its infinite wisdom, has decided that trees will civilize the prairie, will break the wind, will somehow transform this grassland into farmable territory, suitable for Eastern agricultural methods. It is a beautiful theory. It will prove as false as every other promise the government has made about this land. The shanty measures perhaps 12 feet by 14 feet. 4 walls, a roof, a door, 2 windows. This is their home. Inside, a small stove for cooking and heat. A bed, a table with 2 chairs. Almanzo has furnished it with what he could afford, which is not much. But there are dishes, blankets, basic supplies. He has been a bachelor farmer for 6 years. He knows how to survive with little. Laura steps inside and surveys her new domain. She does not cry or express disappointment. Women who survived what she has survived. Childhood poverty. Relentless relocations, the long winter of 1880 to 1881 when the entire town of De Smet nearly starved. Do not waste energy on disappointment. She sets down her small bundle of possessions. She touches the stove, checking its condition. She opens the cupboard to inventory supplies. She's already calculating, already planning, already working. Outside, the August sun beats down on 320 acres of land, Almanzo's original homestead plus the tree claim. The grass stretches in every direction, broken only by occasional shanties of other settlers who have answered the same siren call: free land, prosperity, the American dream of ownership. The railroad reached De Smet 5 years ago, and in its wake came thousands of settlers, each believing that this time, this place, their efforts will succeed where so many others have failed. The Dakota boom is at its peak. Land values are rising. Towns are sprouting along the railroad like mushrooms after rain. Newspapers back east trumpet the success stories, the wheat yields, the fortunes being made. What they do not print are the failure rates, the abandoned claims, the families who arrive with hope and depart with nothing. Almanzo and Laura are aware of the risks. They would be fools not to be. But awareness changes nothing when the alternative is remaining landless, working for others, never building equity in anything that cannot be taken away. That first night in the shanty, they lie in bed listening to the wind move through the grass. It sounds like the ocean, though neither of them has ever seen the ocean. It sounds like promise. It sounds like danger. It sounds like the future, whatever that future holds. Laura is 18 years old. Almanzo's 28. They have their health, their strength, their land, and each other. It feels like enough. For one night, it feels like everything. The autumn of 1885 passes in a blur of labour that redefines what Laura understood work to mean. Teaching school was exhausting. Managing children, preparing lessons, maintaining order in one-room schoolhouses heated by temperamental stoves. But that exhaustion was mental, social, performative. This exhaustion is physical, cellular, the kind that settles into bones and remains there permanently. Almanzo rises before dawn every morning. The horses need tending. He owns a pair of matched Morgan horses named Skip and Barnum, gifts from his father James back in Spring Valley, Minnesota. These horses represent significant capital, the kind of investment that can make or break a farming operation. They must be fed, watered, groomed, their health monitored constantly, because a sick horse means lost labour, means lost crops, means financial ruin. The chain of causation on the frontier is ruthlessly direct. Laura learns the rhythm of farm work in ways her childhood never prepared her for. Her father Charles was many things: carpenter, store clerk, railroad worker, occasional farmer, but never a successful commercial farmer. The Ingalls family moved too often, pursued too many schemes, never stayed long enough to build the kind of operation Almanzo is attempting. Laura has seen farming. She has never done it at this scale, with this level of investment and risk. She milks the cow before breakfast. The cow is named Ellen, and she is temperamental, prone to kicking if her udder is handled roughly. Laura learns to speak softly, to move carefully, to extract milk without triggering bovine rage. The milk goes into the separator, cream for butter, skim milk for drinking and cooking. Nothing is wasted. Waste is a luxury that homesteaders cannot afford. Breakfast is simple: fried salt pork, bread, coffee. The bread is Laura's responsibility. She bakes twice a week, kneading dough until her arms ache, feeding the fire to maintain the precise temperature the oven requires. Too hot and the bread burns, too cool and it remains doughy inside. She learns through trial and error, through loaves that turn out dense and heavy, through batches that refuse to rise. By October, she can produce bread that Almanzo eats without comment, which is frontier approval. After breakfast, the work divides along traditional lines but with frontier modifications. Almanzo heads to the fields, ploughing, preparing the soil for next spring's wheat planting. Laura tends the house, but the house is small and there are only 2 people living in it, which means housework occupies perhaps 2 hours. The remaining daylight hours demand other employment. She begins helping outside more than any housewife in Spring Valley, or even De Smet would consider proper. She learns to harness horses, to drive them, to feel through the reins when they are pulling evenly, and when one is favouring a leg. She learns to stack hay, her arms screaming with the unfamiliar motion, blisters forming and breaking and forming again until her hands develop calluses thick as leather. She learns to read weather, the particular quality of light that precedes storms, the wind shifts that signal temperature changes, the cloud formations that promise rain or merely threaten it without delivering. The tree claim requires constant attention. The Timber Culture Act demands that Almanzo plant and cultivate 10 acres of trees. He has planted cottonwoods and box elders, fast-growing species that might actually survive the Dakota climate. But survival requires water, protection from wind, vigilant monitoring for disease and pests. Laura finds herself carrying water buckets to saplings, wrapping burlap around trunks to shield them from rabbits that strip bark with methodical efficiency. The government's vision of a forested prairie depends on labour that the government does not acknowledge or compensate. By November, the brutal truth of Dakota seasons asserts itself. The temperature drops with shocking speed. One week it is pleasant autumn weather, jacket sufficient for morning chill. The next week it is below freezing at night, ice forming in the water bucket inside the shanty. The wind that sounded poetic in August becomes a knife in November, cutting through every gap in the walls, every imperfect seal around windows and door. They winterize the shanty with what they have: rags stuffed in cracks, additional layers of newspaper pasted to walls for insulation, a banked fire that must never go completely out because rekindling in sub-zero temperatures is dangerous and time-consuming. Laura learns to sleep wearing nearly as many clothes as she wears during the day. She learns that washing is a luxury reserved for mild days when wet hair will not freeze before it dries. She learns that the romance of frontier life exists only in novels written by people who have never spent January on the Dakota Prairie. December brings the first blizzard. It strikes without much warning, clouds on the horizon, wind picking up, then suddenly the world disappears into white chaos. Almanzo's in the barn when it hits. Laura stands at the window, heart pounding, knowing that men have died walking from barn to house in weather like this, disoriented by blowing snow, freezing to death 20 feet from safety. She lights the lamp, sets it in the window, a beacon. 20 minutes later, Almanzo stumbles through the door, his beard crusted with ice, his coat stiff as wood. He does not speak. He simply stands by the stove, thawing. They survive that blizzard and the dozen others that follow. They survive because they are young and strong and determined. They survive because surrender means abandoning the claim, losing everything they have invested, returning to their parents as failures. So they do not surrender. They endure, and they begin planning for spring, for the wheat crop that will either validate their struggle or reveal it as delusion. Spring arrives in April of 1886 with the kind of hope that only those who have survived a Dakota winter can fully appreciate. The snow melts, revealing grass that seemed dead but was merely dormant. The ground thaws. The mud becomes legendary, thick, clinging, capable of sucking boots off feet and wheels off wagons. But mud means moisture, and moisture means the possibility of crops. So no one complains about the mud. Almanzo begins ploughing in late April. The breaking plough cuts through sod that has never been disturbed, turning over earth that is black and rich, layered with centuries of decomposed grass roots. This soil, the boosters and railroad companies promise, will grow wheat like nowhere else on earth. The sod is so thick that it requires multiple passes with the plough. The horses straining against the resistance, Almanzo walking behind the plough for hours each day, his legs and back developing the particular ache that defines farming. By mid-May, the wheat is planted. Almanzo uses seed he purchased on credit from the Dismantling mercantile, debt that will be repaid when the wheat is harvested and sold. This credit system is how frontier farming operates. Borrow for seed and supplies in spring. Repay from harvest proceeds in fall. It works beautifully when harvests succeed. When harvests fail, the debt remains while the income disappears. The mathematics are simple and brutal. Laura watches the wheat emerge in late May, tiny green shoots pushing through the dark soil, transforming the field into something that looks almost like the promised prosperity. By June, the wheat stands several inches tall, and by July it has reached knee height, the heads forming, the kernels developing inside. Almanzo walks the field daily, checking for signs of disease or pest damage, monitoring the moisture level, calculating yields in his mind. If the weather holds, if the rain continues in moderate amounts, if hail stays away, if the hot winds that can parch a crop in days remain absent, they might harvest 30 bushels per acre. At current prices, that represents enough income to repay debts, purchase supplies for winter, and perhaps even save a modest amount. August arrives with heat that transforms the prairie into an oven. The wheat ripens, turning from green to golden, the heads heavy with kernels. Another week, and it will be ready for harvest. Almanzo makes arrangements to hire help. Harvest requires more labour than 2 people can provide. He sharpens the scythe blades, checks the condition of the wagon, prepares for the work that will determine whether this year represents progress or merely survival. On August 7th, 1886, the western horizon darkens in the early afternoon. Clouds build with unnatural speed, towering into the sky, their undersides greenish black. Almanzo is in the field. He sees the storm coming and begins running toward the house, shouting for Laura. She's already outside, watching the sky with the sick certainty of someone who has heard stories about what those clouds contain. The wind arrives first, gusting with enough force to bend the wheat flat to tear loose anything not secured. Then comes the sound, a roar like a train approaching, growing louder, impossible to ignore, and then the hail begins. The stones are small at first, pea-sized, striking the ground with sharp cracks. Within seconds they grow larger, marble-sized, then egg-sized, then larger than eggs. They fall with the force of stones thrown in anger, covering the ground in white, piling up in drifts, shredding the wheat that stood golden and ready just minutes before. Almanzo and Laura stand on the shanty's small porch, watching their entire crop destroyed in less than 15 minutes. The wheat that took months to plant and grow, that represented their entire investment of labour and borrowed capital, is gone. The hail strips the kernels from the heads, beats the stalks flat, reduces the field to a battered ruin that looks like a battlefield after artillery bombardment. When the storm finally passes, leaving the ground white with hail and the air smelling of broken vegetation, Almanzo walks into the field. Laura follows. They stand among the destruction, saying nothing because there is nothing to say. The mathematics are immediate and inescapable. No harvest means no income. No income means the debt for seed and supplies remains unpaid. Unpaid debt means creditors will demand payment, or extend the debt with accumulated interest. The mercantile owner is not cruel, but he is running a business, not a charity. Credit extended must eventually be repaid or the entire system collapses. That night, Laura makes dinner from their dwindling supplies. They eat in silence. Almanzo's face has the closed, hard expression of a man calculating options and finding none of them appealing. They could abandon the claim, return to their families, admit defeat. But abandonment means forfeiting the 5 years of residency Almanzo has already invested, means losing the land entirely, means starting over somewhere else with even less than they have now. "We plant again next year," Almanzo says finally. Laura nods. There is no other choice. The frontier offers no do-overs, but it does offer next year another chance, the perpetual gamble that conditions will improve, that luck will shift, that persistence will be rewarded. Every failed settler who ever abandoned a claim believed they were being realistic. Every successful settler who endured believed they were being foolish right up until the moment they succeeded. The difference between wisdom and stupidity reveals itself only in retrospect. December brings another pressure. Laura is pregnant. She discovers this with the mixture of joy and terror that frontier women know intimately. A child represents hope, family, the future they're building. A child also represents another mouth to feed, medical expenses they can barely afford, the physical danger that childbirth poses in a place where the nearest doctor may be hours away, and professional obstetric care is a luxury reserved for wealthy women in eastern cities. On December 5th, 1886, Laura gives birth to a daughter. They name her Rose, a name that suggests beauty and hope and delicate things surviving against harsh conditions. Rose is healthy. her lungs strong, her grip surprisingly powerful for something so small. Laura recovers slowly from childbirth, her body depleted by the months of pregnancy during which nutrition was barely adequate. Almanzo looks at his daughter and his wife in the empty fields beyond the shanty, and he makes the calculation every frontier father makes. This child will eat, will be clothed, will survive, because failure is not an option he can permit himself to consider. So he begins planning for the spring of 1887, for the second crop, for the second chance that the frontier promises to those stubborn enough to keep demanding it. Spring arrives in 1887 with the kind of optimism that only desperation can manufacture. Almanzo stands in the field where last year's wheat died under hail, and he plants again. There is no alternative. The debt from the previous year's failure sits in the ledger like an unpaid sentence. The only path forward involves betting everything on the next crop, on the promise that weather is random, that last year's hail was an anomaly, that this year will be different. Laura watches from the shanty door, Rose balanced on her hip. The baby is 5 months old now, growing heavier, more aware. She tracks movement with her eyes, reaches for objects with clumsy hands, makes sounds that are not quite words but close enough to suggest the words are coming. Laura should feel joy at these milestones. Instead, she feels the weight of another mouth to feed, another body to clothe, another reason why failure is not an option they can afford. The planting proceeds according to the ancient rhythm: plough, seed, pray. Almanzo works dawn to dusk, his hands blistered, his back aching with the particular pain that comes from walking behind horses for 10 hours straight. The horses themselves, Skip and Barnum, those gifts from his father that represent both capital and expectation, pull the plough with mechanical precision. They do not understand debt or crop failure, or the difference between prosperity and ruin. They understand only the commands Almanzo gives them: left, right, stop, go. By June, the wheat has emerged. Green shoots cover the field in rows so straight they look like someone drew them with a ruler. Laura allows herself a moment of hope. The crop looks healthy. The weather has been cooperative. Enough rain to germinate the seed, enough sun to encourage growth, no hail. Perhaps last year was indeed an anomaly. Perhaps the frontier is not actively hostile, but merely indifferent, and indifference can be managed through work. July brings the heat, not the normal summer warmth of Dakota territory, which is substantial but bearable, but something different, something vindictive. The temperature climbs past 90 degrees and stays there. The wind shifts, coming now from the south and west rather than the cooler north. And it brings with it air that feels like standing in front of an open oven, dry, scorching, relentless. The hot winds, the sirocco, the phenomenon that would later be studied and documented and given scientific names. But in 1887 is simply called bad luck or God's will, depending on who is doing the talking. The air temperature reaches 100 degrees, then 105. The wheat, which had looked so promising in June, begins to wither. The green fades to yellow, then to brown. The heads that should be filling with kernels remain light, hollow, worthless. Almanzo walks the field in the evening when the heat has dropped from unbearable to merely oppressive. He touches the wheat stalks, feeling their brittleness, confirming what his eyes already tell him. This crop will not make harvest. The kernels are shriveled, undersized, insufficient for milling. He could harvest it and try to sell it as animal feed, but the yield would barely cover the cost of harvest labour. More likely it would not even do that. Laura sees his face when he returns to the shanty. He does not need to speak. The set of his jaw, the way his shoulders slump, the silence that surrounds him like a physical presence, these communicate everything. The second crop has failed. Not through hail this time, not through some dramatic weather event that arrives with violence and spectacle, but through simple, grinding environmental hostility. The land they were promised was fertile and forgiving, has revealed itself to be marginal at best, actively destructive at worst. That night, They sit at the small table and perform the arithmetic of failure. The seed purchased on credit, unpaid. The equipment, wear and labour invested, unrecoverable. The mortgage on the homestead, taken out to cover last year's losses, still outstanding with interest accumulating. The general store account in Dismantling, where they purchase flour and sugar and coffee and the 1,000 small necessities that homesteaders cannot produce themselves, growing larger each month. Rose sleeps in her cradle, unaware that her parents are calculating whether they can afford to keep farming or whether surrender is the only rational choice. Laura's teaching certificate sits in a drawer, unused. She could return to teaching, could earn actual wages that arrive with predictable regularity rather than the boom or bust uncertainty of agriculture. But teaching would require leaving Rose with someone else, would require giving up the partnership she and Almanzo are trying to build, would represent a different kind of failure. "We plant again next year," Almanzo says finally. His voice is flat, drained of emotion. "We have to," Laura nods. She understands the logic even if she hates it. Walking away now means losing everything they have already invested. The land, the improvements, the years of residency that count toward proving up the claim. Walking away means admitting that Charles Ingalls was right, that the frontier is a trap dressed up as opportunity, that the Wilders are no different from the dozens of other families already abandoning their claims and heading back east or further west or anywhere that is not here, so they will stay. They will plant again. They will bet their future on the possibility that the third time will be different, that weather patterns will shift, that rainfall will return, that the Dakota territory will transform from adversary to partner. It is not hope, exactly. It is the absence of alternatives. Winter descends on Dakota territory in November of 1887, with a fury that makes last year's cold seem almost gentle by comparison. The temperature drops below zero and remains there for weeks. The wind howls across the prairie, finding every gap in the shanty's walls, every imperfect seal around the windows. Laura stuffs rags into cracks that appear overnight, as if the cold itself is physically prying the boards apart. Rose, now a year old, develops a cough that rattles in her small chest. Laura holds her through the long nights, listening to the laboured breathing, feeling the fever that comes and goes with terrifying randomness. There is no doctor close enough to summon for a simple cough. Doctors cost money they do not have, and doctors cannot cure what winter and poverty create together. So Laura does what frontier mothers do. She makes steam by boiling water on the stove, holds Rose in the warm mist, rubs her chest with camphor, and prays to whatever god might be listening. The cough eventually subsides, but the fear it generates remains. Every illness on the frontier carries the potential for death. Childhood mortality is not a statistic. It is the empty cradles in the cemetery, the small graves marked with wooden crosses that weather and fade until the names become illegible. Laura has seen enough of those graves. She will do everything in her power to ensure Rose does not occupy one. February of 1888 arrives with temperatures that fluctuate wildly, sub-zero one day, above freezing the next, creating cycles of freeze and thaw that turn the paths around the shanty into treacherous ice. And with the temperature fluctuations comes the sickness. It starts in town. The Kingsbury County News reports cases of diphtheria circulating through Dismantling. The disease is a terror that every frontier community knows intimately, a bacterial infection that strikes the throat, creating a membrane that can suffocate victims, particularly children. There is no cure. There is no prevention beyond isolation, which is nearly impossible in small communities where everyone depends on everyone else for survival. Laura hears the reports and makes a decision. They will avoid town. They will make do with what supplies they have. They will not attend church services or social gatherings. They will quarantine themselves on the tree claim and pray that distance provides protection. It does not. The first symptom appears in the early March, a sore throat that Almanzo mentions casually over breakfast. By evening, his fever has climbed high enough that his face is flushed, his eyes glassy. Laura touches his forehead and feels heat radiating through her palm. The dread that has been lurking at the edge of her consciousness for weeks crystallizes into certainty. Diphtheria has found them. Within 48 hours, Laura's own throat begins to ache. She looks in the small mirror they keep above the wash basin and sees the telltale white patches forming at the back of her throat, the pseudo-membrane that gives diphtheria its deadly reputation. Her fever climbs. Her body aches with an intensity that makes every movement an act of will. Rose is sent to stay with Charles and Caroline Ingalls in town. Laura's parents arrive with a wagon, bundle up their granddaughter and take her away to safety. Laura watches through fever-glazed eyes as her daughter disappears down the road, and she understands with perfect clarity that she may never see Rose again. Diphtheria kills. It kills children most reliably, but it kills adults too. Mortality rates hover between 5 and 20%, depending on the severity of infection and the strength of the patient. The doctor comes, Dr. Cushman from Desmet, a man whose medical training consists of whatever apprenticeship he completed years ago back east, and whatever experience he's gained treating frontier ailments. He examines their throats, confirms the diagnosis that was already obvious, and provides the only treatment available: rest, fluids, and hope. There is no antitoxin. That medical miracle will not be discovered for another 6 years. There are no antibiotics. Those are decades away. There is only the body's immune system and luck. Laura's case is described in the Kingsbury County News as dangerous. Her fever spikes high enough that she loses coherent thought, drifts in and out of consciousness, experiences the delirium that accompanies severe infection. She will later remember almost nothing of this period, only fragments of sensation, the taste of water that Almanzo helps her drink, the weight of blankets, the sound of wind against the shanty walls. Almanzo's case is initially labelled light, which in the optimistic language of frontier medicine means he is expected to survive. His fever is lower than Laura's, his throat pain is manageable, he remains ambulatory, able to care for himself and assist with Laura's care when she's too weak to rise from bed. They survive. By mid-March, the fevers break. The throat membranes begin to slough away. Their bodies, battered and weakened but intact, begin the slow process of recovery. Dr. Cushman, making his follow-up visit, pronounces them out of danger. Rose is returned from her grandparents' home. The family reunites, thinner and exhausted, but alive. For approximately 2 weeks, it appears that they have won, that they have faced down one of the frontier's most feared killers and emerged victorious. Laura begins to resume her household duties. Almanzo plans the spring planting. They discuss repaying the $800 they had to borrow to cover the medical expenses and the lost labour time. A new debt added to the existing pile, but at least they are alive to repay it. Then Almanzo's legs stop working. It happens on a cold morning in the late March. Almanzo rises from bed as he has every morning for 28 years of his life, an automatic action requiring no conscious thought. Except this morning, when his feet touch the floor, his legs do not support his weight. He stumbles, catches himself on the bed frame, and looks down at his lower body with confusion that transforms rapidly into horror. "I can't feel my legs," he says. The words hang in the air between them. Laura, already awake and preparing breakfast, turns from the stove. She sees her husband gripping the bed frame, his knuckles white, his face drained of colour. She crosses the small room in 3 steps and helps him sit back on the bed. "What do you mean you can't feel them?" she asks. Though she already knows what he means. She understands with terrible clarity that the diphtheria, which they believed they had survived, has delivered a delayed blow. Almanzo describes the sensation, or rather, the absence of sensation. His legs from mid-thigh downward are numb, heavy, unresponsive to his commands. When Laura touches his calf, he cannot feel her hand. When she pricks his foot with a pin, a crude test for nerve function, he reports no pain. Dr. Cushman is summoned again. He examines Almanzo with the kind of thoroughness that medical knowledge of 1888 permits, which is to say he performs a basic neurological assessment and arrives at a diagnosis that is part medical observation and part educated guess. a slight stroke of paralysis from overexertion too soon after the diphtheria. The term stroke in 1888 carries different meaning than it does in modern medicine. Cushman likely means some form of neurological damage, possibly post-infectious neuropathy, possibly cardiac complications from diphtheria, toxin, affecting the heart and thereby blood flow to extremities, possibly something else entirely. Medical science will not develop the tools to distinguish between these conditions for decades. What matters is not the precise mechanism, but the result. Almanzo Wilder, at age 31, has lost significant function in his legs. Over the following weeks, the paralysis partially recedes. Not completely, it never will be complete, but enough that Almanzo can stand with assistance, can walk with a cane, can perform limited physical labour. His hands, which were initially clumsy and stiff, regain most of their dexterity. But his legs remain weak. His gait develops a pronounced limp. He cannot run. He cannot step over obstacles without risk of falling. He cannot perform the kind of sustained physical labour that farming demands. The transformation in household dynamics is immediate and total. Laura, who's been managing domestic duties while Almanzo handled outdoor labour, now finds herself doing both. She feeds the horses, milks the cow, hauls water, chops wood, tasks that require strength she barely possesses. Her body, still recovering from diphtheria, protests every additional demand. But there is no alternative. The work must be done or they will not eat. The animals will suffer. The farm will collapse. Almanzo's psychological state during this period is something Laura will never fully describe in her writings, but it can be inferred from the silences, from the brief mentions of his frustration and anger. A man who has defined himself through physical capability, who came to Dakota territory specifically to prove himself as a farmer and landowner, now requires a cane to walk from the shanty to the barn. The loss of identity is perhaps more devastating than the loss of physical function. They attempt to continue farming. In the spring of 1888, they plant again, a third crop, following 2 consecutive failures. But the planting proceeds differently now. Almanzo cannot walk behind the plough for 10-hour days. He cannot lift heavy sacks of seed. He cannot perform half the tasks that successful farming requires. They hire help when they can afford it, which is rarely. Laura takes on more of the physical labour, her body adapting to demands it was never intended to meet. The summer of 1888 brings another round of hot winds and drought. The wheat planted with such effort and expense withers in the fields. The third crop fails just as completely as the first 2. And now, in addition to the accumulated debt from previous failures, they have medical bills and the ongoing cost of Almanzo's disability, the cane he requires, the modified equipment he must use, the hired help they cannot afford but desperately need. By autumn of 1888, the arithmetic of failure has become undeniable. They cannot continue. The homestead that Almanzo spent nearly a decade establishing, the tree claim they moved to after their marriage, the dream of frontier prosperity, all of it is collapsing under the weight of environmental hostility and physical disability. They sell the homestead in July of 1888 to Ira Dexter for $1,200. On paper, this represents a profit. Almanzo invested less than that in improvements and years of labour. In reality, the outstanding mortgage consumes most of the proceeds. What remains barely covers their accumulated debts. The sale transforms them from landowners to tenants on what was formerly Almanzo's tree claim. Laura watches her husband struggle with this diminishment. He is no longer a homesteader on the verge of prosperity. He is a disabled man living on borrowed land, unable to perform the work that might restore their fortunes, trapped in a body that has betrayed him, and a landscape that offers no mercy. She sees him try to perform simple tasks, harnessing a horse, climbing a ladder, walking across uneven ground, and fail. She sees the frustration and shame that accompanies each failure. And she makes a decision that will define the rest of their lives. She will not let him see her despair. She will not add her emotional collapse to his burdens. She will carry the weight silently, will maintain the facade of hope even when hope seems like a delusion, will keep moving forward because stopping means surrender, and surrender means death of a different kind. The diphtheria took Almanzo's legs. The hot winds took their crops. The frontier took their dreams. But Laura Ingalls Wilder, at 21 years old, decides that she will not let it take their marriage. She will not let it take their family. She will not let it take the last shreds of dignity they still possess. So she lifts the water buckets that are too heavy for her frame. She chops the wood that makes her arms scream with pain. She plants and harvests and cooks and cleans and cares for Rose and supports Almanzo through the worst period of his life. And she does it all with the grim determination of someone who understands that survival is not about triumph. It is about refusing to quit when quitting would be easier. The prairie wind howls outside the shanty. Winter approaches again, and somewhere in the darkness ahead 2 more disasters wait their turn. The winter of 1888 to 1889 passes in a blur of survival that has become routine. Almanzo walks with his cane from shanty to barn, from barn to town, his gait uneven but determined. The paralysis has settled into permanent residence in his legs, not complete immobility, but enough limitation that certain tasks are now impossible. He cannot run. He cannot climb ladders without risk of falling. He cannot perform the sustained physical labour that commercial wheat farming demands. Laura compensates. She hauls water that is too heavy for her frame. She splits wood that leaves splinters embedded in her palms. She feeds livestock, repairs fences, performs the outdoor work that frontier culture designates as masculine. Rose, now 2 years old, toddles around the shanty, oblivious to the economic catastrophe unfolding around her. She knows only that Papa walks funny now, that Mama's hands are always red and rough, that there is less sugar in the oatmeal than there used to be. The tree claim, the 160 acres they now occupy after selling the homestead, represents the last remnant of their Dakota dream. The trees Almanzo planted under the Timber Culture Act are growing, though whether they will ever constitute the forest the government envisioned is doubtful. The wheat field lies fallow. There is no capital for seed, no physical capacity for Almanzo to farm it properly, no reason to believe the 4th crop would succeed where 3 have failed. In December of 1888, Laura discovers she is pregnant again. The news arrives with complicated emotions. A child represents hope, family, continuity, the possibility that life contains more than grinding poverty and physical disability. But a child also represents danger and expense. Laura nearly died giving birth to Rose. The recovery took weeks, and now, with their financial situation more desperate than it was in 1886, adding another mouth to feed seems almost reckless. But frontier families do not prevent pregnancies. The biology of marriage proceeds according to its own logic, indifferent to economic conditions. So Laura accepts the pregnancy the way she has accepted everything else that Dakota territory has delivered, with grim determination and the understanding that complaining changes nothing. The winter months bring the usual hardships magnified by pregnancy. Morning sickness strikes in January, though the term morning is generous. The nausea persists throughout the day, triggered by smells that were previously tolerable. The salt pork frying in the pan, the kerosene lamp burning in the evening, the unwashed wool of Almanzo's winter coat. Laura forces herself to eat because the baby requires nourishment, but every meal is an act of will. By March, the pregnancy is visible. Her dresses no longer fit properly. She lets out seams, adds panels, makes do with what she has because there is no money for maternity clothing, and the general store in De Smet extends credit only for necessities. A new dress does not qualify as necessary when the old one can be altered with needle and thread. Spring arrives in April with muddy roads and the return of prairie birds. The wheat that should be planted remains unplanted. Almanzo attempts some of the work, driving the wagon to town, repairing equipment, but the heavy labour is beyond his capacity. They discuss hiring help, but hired help requires wages they do not possess. So the field remains empty, and the tree claim produces nothing except the minimal subsistence they can coax from the garden and the few chickens they keep. Laura's body swells through May and June. The baby sits low and heavy, making every movement laborious. She continues her work because stopping is not an option. The cow must be milked. The chickens must be fed. Rose must be tended. Almanzo helps where he can, but his limitations mean Laura shoulders burdens that would challenge a healthy woman, let alone one in the final months of pregnancy. The heat arrives in July with the same oppressive intensity that destroyed their crops in previous summers. The temperature climbs past 90 degrees and remains there. The shanty, with its thin walls and poor ventilation, becomes an oven. Laura sleeps fitfully, her swollen body unable to find comfortable position on the narrow bed. She wakes multiple times each night, her back aching, her feet swollen, her mind calculating dates and worrying about what comes next. By early July, the baby has dropped, settling into position for birth. Laura knows the signs from her experience with Rose. The contractions begin as a vague tightness in her abdomen, easily dismissed as normal pregnancy discomfort. But over the course of 2 days they intensify, becoming regular, unmistakable, undeniable. On July 11th, 1889, in the afternoon heat that makes the air shimmer above the prairie grass, Laura's labour begins in earnest. Almanzo sends for Dr. Henry C. Hunter, the physician in Desmet. Laura Ingalls arrives to assist. Frontier births are women's work, supervised by doctors only when complications arise. And complications, Laura knows from the weight and position of this baby, are likely. The labour is severe. The manuscript Laura will write 50 years later describes it with brutal honesty that her editors will eventually remove. There was no merciful chloroform and the baby weighed 10 pounds. 10 pounds. For context, the average newborn weighs 7 pounds. This baby is massive and Laura's body, already weakened by 3 years of hardship, inadequate nutrition, and relentless physical labour, must somehow deliver him. The afternoon stretches into evening. The pain becomes all-consuming, obliterating everything except the immediate present. There is no past, no future, only the contractions that grip her body with rhythmic violence. Caroline holds her hand. Dr. Hunter monitors the baby's position. Almanzo waits outside, useless, his disability rendering him unable to help with the one thing that matters most. And finally, as the sun sets over the Dakota Prairie, the baby arrives. A son, 10 pounds, healthy, screaming with impressive lung capacity. The Desmet leader publishes a brief notice on July 13th. Dr. Hunter reports the arrival of a 10-pound boy at A.J. Wilder's on Thursday night. The announcement is standard. Frontier newspapers record births, deaths, and social visits with equal brevity. But what the newspaper does not report is the cost of that birth, the physical trauma Laura endures in the days that follow. The birth itself required stitches, a delicate way of saying that Laura's body tore under the strain of delivering a 10-pound infant. Dr. Hunter performed the procedure without anaesthesia, because anaesthesia on the frontier is reserved for amputations and major surgeries, not routine childbirth complications. The pain of the stitches rivals the pain of the birth itself, and then there is the heat, the relentless July heat that creates what Laura will later describe as scalded spots on her back from lying in sweat-soaked bedding during recovery. The baby, unlike his difficult entrance into the world, seems healthy. He nurses well. He sleeps in the fitful, irregular pattern of all newborns. He has dark hair and features that Laura's younger sister Grace will later describe in her diary as looking just like Manly. For the first time in months, perhaps years, there is something in the wild Ashanti that resembles Joy. They do not name him. This fact, the absence of a name, will puzzle later generations. Why would parents not name their child? The answer lies in 19th century frontier pragmatism. Infant mortality hovers between 15 and 20%. Many parents delay formal naming until the baby survives the vulnerable first weeks, avoiding the psychological investment that makes loss even more devastating. It is not that they love the child less. It is that they are trying to protect themselves from grief that experience has taught them is statistically likely. So the baby remains unnamed. Laura calls him the boy in her writing. The family refers to him simply as the baby. And he lives, day by day, through the brutal July heat. Laura's recovery is slow and painful. She cannot resume normal activities immediately. The stitches must heal, her body must recover from the blood loss, that nearly killed her during delivery. But recovery is a luxury that frontier mothers rarely enjoy in full. By the second week, she's up and moving, performing the essential tasks that keep the household functioning. Rose needs care. The animals need tending. Life does not pause for childbirth. Almanzo helps where he can, but his limitations mean the burden falls disproportionately on Laura. He holds the baby while she prepares meals. He watches Rose while Laura rests. But he cannot haul water or chop wood or perform the heavy labour that recovery should exempt Laura from performing. So she does it anyway, her body protesting, the stitches pulling with every movement. The baby thrives initially. He gains weight. His colour is good. He exhibits the normal reflexes that indicate healthy development. For 27 days, the Wilder family exists in a fragile equilibrium, exhausted, poor, physically compromised, but intact. And then, on a Wednesday in early August, the baby begins to convulse. Laura notices it first, the sudden stiffening of his small body, the jerking movements that are unmistakably wrong. She calls for Almanzo, who sends immediately for Dr. Hunter, but De Smet is miles away, and the doctor must be located, informed and transported to the tree claim. Time, which moves slowly during labour and recovery, now accelerates with terrifying speed. The convulsions continue. The baby's body seizes, relaxes, seizes again. His breathing becomes irregular. Laura holds him, helpless, watching her son's distress and unable to stop it. She has no medical training. She has no medications. She has only her hands and her voice, and the desperate hope that Dr. Hunter will arrive in time. He does not. By the time Dr. Hunter's wagon appears on the road, the baby is dead. The exact cause, whether infection, metabolic disorder, congenital defect, or some other condition that 1889 medicine cannot diagnose, will never be determined. The medical language of the era describes it as spasms, a term that encompasses various forms of infantile seizures without distinguishing their origin. There is no autopsy. There is no investigation. There is only a dead baby and two parents who must now bury their unnamed son. The De Smet leader publishes another brief notice on August 10th. Mr. and Mrs. A.J. Wilder's little child died Wednesday evening. No name, no age, no cause, just the bare fact of death, recorded with the same economy as the birth announcement 27 days earlier. Grace Ingalls, Laura's youngest sister, writes in her diary with more personal detail, "Laura's little baby boy, only a month old, died a little while ago. He looked just like Manly." The entry captures what the newspaper omits: the personal loss, the physical resemblance, the grief that will never appear in public record. They bury him in De Smet Cemetery. The grave is unmarked or minimally marked. Frontier families often used wooden markers that weathered and disappeared within years. Decades later, when Laura corresponds with the De Smet Cemetery Association, the exact burial location will be uncertain. The baby, who lived 27 days, will leave almost no physical trace of his existence. Laura will spend the rest of her 90 years rarely mentioning him. Her daughter Rose will not learn she had a brother until reading her mother's manuscript after Laura's death, 70 years after the baby was born. The silence is not indifference. It is survival. Some griefs are too heavy to carry in the open. 16 days after burying their son, Laura Ingalls Wilder is baking bread. The mundane nature of this activity is important to understand. Life continues, even through grief. The bread must be made because bread is what people eat, and eating is what keeps bodies functional, and functional bodies are required for survival. So Laura stands at the stove in the small frame house on the tree claim, mixing dough, managing the fire that frontier cooking demands. Rose is in the kitchen with her. The 5-year-old girl is at the age where supervision is negotiable, old enough to be trusted for moments at a time, young enough to be unpredictable. Laura's attention is divided between the bread and her daughter and the grief that sits like a physical weight in her chest. She's not sleeping well. Her body is still recovering from childbirth. Her milk, with no baby to nurse, is causing physical pain as it gradually stops production. Every aspect of her existence is uncomfortable. The fire in the stove requires careful management. Too hot and the bread burns, too cool and it fails to rise properly. Laura has been baking bread for years. She knows the precise balance required. But on this August afternoon, something goes wrong. The exact mechanism of what happens next is not documented with precision. What is known is that Rose, alone for a moment, does something near the stove. Whether she touches the firebox, knocks over a lamp, or simply stands too close to an open flame, the result is immediate and catastrophic. Her dress catches fire. Frontier clothing is universally flammable. Cotton, wool, linen, all untreated with any fire retardant chemicals because such chemicals do not yet exist. A child's dress, once ignited, becomes a death sentence measured in seconds. Laura reacts with the speed that maternal instinct provides. She grabs Rose, smothers the flames with her own body and hands, extinguishes the fire before it can kill her daughter. But the flames have already spread. The kitchen, wood construction, tinder dry in the August heat, has caught. The walls ignite. The fire moves with terrifying speed, consuming the small frame house with an efficiency that seems almost vindictive. Laura grabs Rose and runs outside. Almanzo, alerted by her screams, emerges from the barn. They stand in the yard and watch their home burn. There is no fire department. There is no organised firefighting capacity on isolated homesteads. They have water buckets, but water buckets are useless against a structure fire that has already reached the walls. So they do the only thing possible. They watch. They watch the kitchen burn, then the bedroom, then the roof. They watch the windows shatter from heat. They watch smoke pour into the sky in a column visible for miles. The house that Laura had described in happier times as comfortable, the structure they had built to replace the claim shanty, the physical shelter that represented stability amid chaos. It burns to the ground in less than an hour, and with it burns everything they own. The wedding gifts from 1885, the clothing, the furniture, the dishes, the few books, the photographs, if they had any, Laura's sewing materials, the children's clothing, including the clothes she'd been making for the baby who died 16 days ago. Every physical possession that is not currently on their bodies or in the barn is consumed by fire. When the flames finally subside, leaving only smoking ruins and the stone foundation, Laura and Almanzo and Rose stand in the yard and take inventory of what remains. They have the clothes they are wearing. They have Almanzo's cane. They have the horses and cow in the barn. They have each other. And they have nothing else. Frontier families are accustomed to hardship. They are accustomed to crop failure and illness and financial struggle. But total loss, the complete destruction of home and possessions, is devastating even by frontier standards. The Wilders have no insurance. Insurance is a luxury that requires premium payments they could never afford. The loss is absolute and uncompensated. They build a temporary shanty near the ruins of the house. Laura's description is spare. A 3-room shanty. 3 rooms in a row, likely one for sleeping, one for cooking, one for storage. The construction is hasty, using whatever lumber they can salvage or afford to purchase on credit. It is shelter, barely, sufficient to keep them alive through the approaching winter, but representing a catastrophic decline from the frame house. This 4th disaster, coming 16 days after the death of their son, 1 year after Almanzo's paralysis, 2 years after the 3rd crop failure, 4 years after their wedding, breaks something fundamental. Not their marriage, surprisingly. The marriage endures, but their connection to Dakota territory, their belief that persistence will be rewarded, their hope that next year will be different, these things die in the fire. Laura will write with devastating simplicity, desolate times were upon them. The decision to leave crystallizes in the weeks following the fire. They cannot rebuild. They do not have the resources, the health, or the psychological resilience. The tree claim, which they must continue to occupy to fulfill the Timber Culture Act requirements, has become a prison. They are trapped on land that has killed their crops, crippled Almanzo, buried their son, and burned their home. Staying is not perseverance, it is martyrdom. But leaving requires planning. They must maintain residence long enough to prove up the claim and receive the deed, which they can then sell. They must accumulate minimal resources for relocation. They must decide where to go, because simply fleeing without destination is desperation, not strategy. So they endure through the fall of 1889. They live in the shanty. They perform the minimal work required to demonstrate continued residence. They make plans that exist more in hope than reality, plans to move to Spring Valley, Minnesota, where Almanzo's family lives, plans to escape Dakota territory and the curse that seems to have settled over their lives. On November 2nd, 1889, Dakota territory officially becomes the state of South Dakota. It is a political milestone that means nothing to the Wilders. Statehood does not rebuild their house. Statehood does not resurrect their son. Statehood does not heal Almanzo's legs. It is merely a formality that occurs while their world is ending. By early 1890, the decision is final. They will leave. They will abandon the tree claim, forfeit the years of investment, walk away from the Dakota dream that has cost them nearly everything. Some might call this failure. Laura understands it as survival. The prairie wind blows across the ruins of their burned house. Winter settles in with the same cold indifference it has shown every year, and the Wilders begin the slow, painful process of leaving behind the place that destroyed them, carrying only the scars as evidence of what they endured. 4 disasters in 4 years. Most couples would not have survived. Most marriages would have shattered under the weight. But Laura and Almanzo Wilder, broken and scarred and nearly destitute, make a choice that will define the rest of their lives. They choose each other, and they choose to leave. Spring arrives in Dakota territory in May of 1890 with the kind of warmth that feels like mockery. The snow melts, revealing the blackened foundation of the house that burned last August. The grass returns, green and indifferent, growing over the small grave in the Desmet cemetery that marks their son's brief existence. And Almanzo Wilder, leaning heavily on his cane, makes a decision that 5 years ago would have been unthinkable. They are leaving. The Desmet leader publishes the notice on May 17th. A.J. Wilder intends moving with his family to Spring Valley, Min. They will leave in a couple of weeks. The announcement is brief, factual, devoid of the emotional weight it carries. To outside observers, this is simply another family relocating, another adjustment in the constant flux of frontier settlement. But for Laura and Almanzo, it represents something more fundamental: surrender. The mathematics of their situation have become inescapable. The tree claim they occupy is mortgaged. Almanzo's disability makes farming at commercial scale impossible. They have no home beyond the hastily constructed shanty they built after the fire. Their son is buried in soil they will never see again, and the Dakota drought that began in 1887 shows no sign of ending. Other families are leaving too. The population of Desmet, which swelled during the boom years, is contracting as the reality of marginal agricultural land asserts itself. But leaving requires planning. They cannot simply abandon the claim without forfeiting years of investment. Almanzo must prove up the preemption paperwork he filed. After converting his tree claim, a bureaucratic process that requires sworn testimony and patience, and they must accumulate enough capital to make relocation viable rather than merely trading one form of poverty for another. The solution comes in the form of livestock. Almanzo and Peter Ingalls, Laura's uncle, have been raising sheep together, a partnership that represents one of Almanzo's few successful business ventures during the Dakota years. The flock numbers between 200 and 220 sheep, and they sell them in spring of 1890 for enough profit to finance the move. On May 30th, 1890, the Wilder family departs Desmet. The newspaper records it with the same brevity it recorded their intention. A.J. Wilder and family started yesterday overland for Fillmore County, Minnesota. They go by team in order to move more cheaply their 20 head of stock. The phrasing is telling. They travel by wagon rather than train specifically to move cheaply, transporting what livestock they still possess because selling them would yield insufficient proceeds. Laura looks back once as the wagon rolls away from Desmet. Behind them, 4 years of catastrophe compressed into a space so small it could fit on a single page of a ledger. 4 disasters, 1 marriage somehow still intact. Rose, now 3.5 years old, sits between her parents, unaware that she is witnessing the end of one chapter and the uncertain beginning of another. The journey to Spring Valley, Minnesota takes approximately 2 weeks. They travel overland through territory that transforms gradually from prairie to woodland, from the exposed flatness of Dakota to the more forgiving topography of southern Minnesota. The weather is cooperative, spring rain but no major storms. Temperatures mild enough to camp without misery. But even this relatively gentle journey exhausts them. Almanzo's disability makes him a limited driver. He manages the horses but cannot perform the physical labour of making and breaking camp without Laura's assistance. Spring Valley, Minnesota is Almanzo's birthplace, the town where his family established themselves after migrating from New York decades earlier. His parents, James Mason Wilder and Angeline Day Wilder, are elderly now but still living on the family farm. They receive their son, daughter-in-law and granddaughter without fanfare. This is not a triumphant homecoming. It is refuge. The next year, from spring 1890 through fall 1891, passes in a haze of recovery that resembles convalescence more than living. Laura and Almanzo and Rose occupy space in the Wilder family home, dependent on James and Angeline's generosity. Almanzo rests, attempting to regain whatever strength his damaged body can recover. Laura helps with household work, contributing labour to justify their presence. Rose plays with cousins and begins to understand that this place, while temporary, represents safety in ways Dakota never did. But safety is not the same as purpose. Almanzo is 33 years old. He cannot farm at the level his father once did. He cannot return to Dakota. He cannot remain indefinitely in his parents' home, a dependent adult in a culture that values male independence above nearly everything else. So he begins researching alternatives, reading newspapers and pamphlets promoting other locations where a partially disabled man might establish himself. The answer arrives in the form of climate therapy, a medical philosophy popular in the late 19th century that attributes healing properties to specific environments. The theory suggests that Almanzo's paralysis, understood vaguely as nerve damage or stroke effects, might improve in warmer climates, and the warmest climate accessible to a family with limited resources is Florida. In October of 1891, the Wilders board a train heading south. They are travelling to Westville, Florida, a small settlement in the Panhandle near Pensacola. The decision is half hope and half desperation. Hope that Almanzo's health will improve. Desperation to find somewhere they can survive independently. Laura has never been farther south than Dakota. She knows nothing of Florida except what promotional materials promise: warmth, opportunity, healing. The train carries them away from the familiar landscapes of prairie and farmland into territory that feels increasingly alien. And somewhere in Laura's mind, a question forms that will haunt the next decade. Will they ever find a place where the land does not try to kill them? The humidity hits Laura like a physical blow the moment she steps off the train in Westville, Florida. It is October, autumn by northern standards, the season when Dakota air turns crisp and comfortable. But here the air feels thick enough to chew. Sweat forms immediately on her skin, soaking through her cotton dress within minutes. And the smell, vegetation rotting in perpetual dampness, standing water breeding mosquitoes in quantities that defy comprehension, something organic and unfamiliar that makes her stomach clench. This is not improvement. This is a different kind of hell. Westville in 1891 is barely a town, perhaps 200 residents scattered across pine flatwoods and swampy lowlands. The local economy depends on timber and turpentine, industries that require grueling physical labour in brutal heat. The few farms that exist grow crops Laura has never seen: sugarcane, sweet potatoes, crops adapted to sandy soil and relentless moisture. There is no wheat. There are no familiar agricultural rhythms. Everything here operates according to rules Laura does not understand. They rent a small house. Calling it a house is generous. It is more accurately a shack on the outskirts of Westville. The structure sits on stilts to avoid flooding during the rainy season. The roof leaks. The walls allow insects unrestricted access. Laura kills her first palmetto bug, a roach the size of her thumb, and nearly screams. By the end of the first week, she stops killing them individually and simply sweeps them out the door in batches. Rose, now nearly 5 years old, adapts with the resilience of childhood. She finds the lizards fascinating. She learns to watch for snakes. She plays in the sandy soil that bears no resemblance to Dakota prairie dirt. But Laura watches her daughter's sun-darkened skin and worries about fevers, about the mysterious illnesses that seem to flourish in this climate, about danger she cannot anticipate because she does not understand this environment. Almanzo's health does not improve. The theory behind climate therapy, that warmth would restore damaged nerves, proves as false as the rain follows the plough mythology that lured settlers to Dakota. His legs remain weak. His limp persists. The heat and humidity, rather than healing, create new problems: swelling in his feet, exhaustion from minimal exertion, infections in minor cuts that would have healed quickly in drier climates. The cane he carried in Minnesota becomes even more essential in Florida, where uneven ground and perpetual moisture make every step treacherous. Laura finds work doing what she can, sewing, mending, occasionally helping with neighbouring households. But the economic opportunities for a northern woman with no southern connections are severely limited. The local culture is foreign, accents she struggles to understand. Social hierarchies she cannot navigate, suspicion of outsiders that manifests in polite distance. She's tolerated but not welcomed. The climate itself becomes the enemy. Summer in Florida, which they experience in 1892, brings heat that makes Dakota's hot winds seem almost quaint by comparison. The temperature climbs past 95 degrees with humidity so thick that clothing never fully dries. Laura develops heat rash that covers her arms and neck. Rose suffers from prickly heat. Almanzo's condition worsens. The swelling in his legs increases, his energy depletes, his mood darkens into something approaching despair. And then there are the insects. Mosquitoes in clouds so dense they darken the air at dusk. Flies that cover any exposed food within seconds. Ants that invade the house in rivers, devouring anything organic. Spiders the size of Laura's hand that build webs across doorways overnight. She learns to check her shoes before putting them on, to shake out blankets before climbing into bed, to live in a state of constant vigilance against creatures that seem designed specifically to torment northern settlers. By summer of 1892, the experiment is clearly failing. Almanzo's health has not improved. Their financial situation remains precarious. Laura hates Florida with an intensity that surprises her. She had hated the Dakota Prairie after it killed her son and burned her house. But that was hatred born of trauma. This is different. This is visceral rejection of an environment that feels fundamentally incompatible with her existence. The decision to leave crystallizes during a conversation in July. Almanzo admits what they have both known for months. Florida is not working. The climate therapy was wishful thinking. They are spending money they cannot afford to remain in a place that offers nothing except continued discomfort. And while returning to Dakota is impossible, they have nothing there except a mortgage claim and a memories of disaster, they can return to Desmet temporarily, work, save money, and plan more carefully for the next move. In August of 1892, they board the northbound train. Laura watches the Florida landscape disappear through the window with profound relief. She will never return to the South. She will never speak fondly of this period. When she writes her autobiography decades later, she will mention Florida only briefly, dismissing the entire experiment in a few sentences that convey none of the misery she experienced. The train carries them north through Georgia, Tennessee, and eventually back to familiar territory. And somewhere during that journey, Laura makes a private vow. The next place they settle will be chosen carefully, researched thoroughly, and evaluated with the cold pragmatism that 4 disasters and 1 failed relocation have finally taught her. No more romantic frontier dreams, no more believing in promises, only careful calculation and evidence-based decisions. She's 25 years old, and she's already lived enough catastrophe for several lifetimes. The Wilders returned to De Smet in late summer of 1892 as different people than they were when they left 2 years earlier. They are harder, more cautious, stripped of the optimism that once allowed them to believe that persistence alone could overcome structural disadvantage. They rent a small house in town, not on a claim, not on agricultural land, but in De Smet proper, where Almanzo can find odd jobs, and Laura can take in sewing. The next 2 years, from 1892 through July 1894, represent a period of deliberate rebuilding. Almanzo works as a day labourer, doing whatever tasks his disability permits. Carpentry when he can manage it, equipment repair, occasional teamster work driving wagons for others. The wages are modest but regular, and regularity matters more than amount when you're accumulating capital from nothing. Laura works as a seamstress, a trade she learned from her mother and has perfected through necessity. She makes dresses for De Smet women, repairs clothing, does alterations. She charges fair prices and delivers quality work, building a reputation that brings steady customers. More importantly, she saves every dollar that is not immediately required for survival. The memory of having nothing, of standing in the ruins of a burned house with a dead son buried days before, creates a financial discipline that borders on obsession. Rose attends school in De Smet. She's now 6, then 7 years old, learning to read and write, beginning to form memories that will persist into adulthood. She will later describe this period as stable, though unstable would be more accurate. Her parents are working constantly, saving obsessively, planning for a departure that Rose understands is coming but cannot quite envision. In 1893, Laura discovers a pamphlet advertising land in the Missouri Ozarks, specifically the area around Mansfield, Missouri, marketed as the land of the Big Red Apple. The promotional material is not subtle. It promises moderate climate, productive soil, affordable land prices, established rail connections, and a growing fruit industry. Everything Dakota was not, everything Florida failed to be. But Laura and Almanzo do not believe promotional materials anymore. They have learned that lesson with Dakota's rain follows the plow lies and Florida's climate therapy fantasies. Instead, they research methodically. They write letters to Mansfield residents, asking about actual crop yields, actual climate conditions, actual costs. They study maps, analysing rail lines and market access. They calculate what 40 acres would cost and what income it might generate. The information they gather suggests that Mansfield represents genuine opportunity. The Ozarks' climate is moderate, cold winters but nothing like Dakota, hot summers but with lower humidity than Florida. The soil, while rocky, supports fruit trees and mixed agriculture. Land prices are reasonable. 40 acres of unimproved land costs approximately $400, within reach if they save aggressively. And the fruit industry is genuinely growing, with apple orchards producing commercial yields that eastern markets will purchase. By spring of 1894, they have saved $100 in cash, what Laura will later describe as the $100 bill, though it was likely multiple bills totaling that amount. $100 is not sufficient to purchase land outright, but it is sufficient for a down payment and moving expenses. It represents 2 years of unrelenting work, every luxury denied, every penny counted. They sell what little they still own in De Smet. They say goodbye to Laura's family, Charles and Carolyn Ingalls, who have witnessed their daughter's trials with the helpless concern of parents who cannot fix their adult child's problems. The goodbyes are not dramatic. Frontier families understand that children scatter, that distance is the price of opportunity, that extended family clusters are luxuries that economic reality rarely permits. On July 17th, 1894, the Wilder family departs De Smet for the final time. They travel by wagon, a covered wagon loaded with all their possessions, which is not much. Almanzo drives, his cane propped beside him, his legs managing the task because driving requires less walking than nearly any other activity. Laura sits beside him. Rose, now 7 years old, perches in the back among the household goods, watching the prairie disappear behind them. The journey from De Smet, South Dakota to Mansfield, Missouri covers approximately 650 miles. They travel south and east, moving from the open plains into more varied topography, rolling hills, increasing tree cover, rivers that require ferry crossings. The weather is cooperative, late summer heat but no major storms, roads passable, water sources accessible. They camp at night, making small fires, cooking simple meals, sleeping in the wagon or under the stars depending on conditions. The trip takes approximately 6 weeks. By late August, they cross into Missouri. The landscape shifts noticeably. More trees, less grass, rocky outcroppings, a different quality of light filtering through forest canopy. This is not prairie, this is hill country, and it feels simultaneously foreign and promising. They arrive in Mansfield, Missouri on August the 30th, 1894. The town is small, perhaps 400 residents, but established, with actual brick buildings, a railroad depot, churches, schools, all the markers of a community that has moved beyond the initial settlement phase. The Mansfield Hotel offers temporary accommodation while they search for land. Within days, they identify a property, 40 acres approximately 1 mile from town, selling for $400. The land is rough, timber that needs clearing, rocky soil that will require brutal labour to cultivate, no house, no barn, no improvements of any kind. It is raw land in every sense. But it is also affordable, well-positioned relative to town and rail access, and available for purchase with their $100 down payment plus agreement to pay the remaining $300 over time. They make the purchase on September 2nd, 1894. The deed transfers ownership of 40 acres to A.J. Wilder. Not to both of them, because married women's property rights remain limited even in 1894, but to Almanzo with the understanding that this is a family investment. This land, which they will eventually name Rocky Ridge Farm, represents their last chance at establishing permanent roots. But in September of 1894, standing on 40 acres of timber and rock, they do not yet know that this gamble will succeed. They know only that they are starting over, again, with nearly nothing, carrying the scars of 4 disasters and 2 failed relocations. Almanzo is 37 years old, permanently disabled, exhausted. Laura is 27, harder than the girl who married at 18, carrying grief that will never fully heal. They pitch a tent on their new land. Rose helps gather firewood, and they begin the work of building, yet again, in a place they desperately hope will finally be kind to them. The prairie is behind them. The disasters are behind them. Whether the future holds anything except more struggle remains unknown, but they are still together. Against all odds, the marriage that should have shattered under the weight of crop failure, paralysis, infant death, and fire has endured. That endurance, more than any land or house or financial success, is the true measure of what they have accomplished. The Dakota nightmare is over. The Missouri future is just beginning. The 40 acres Almanzo purchases in September of 1894 bears no resemblance to the flat, treeless expanse of Dakota territory. This is hill country, Ozark terrain where limestone outcroppings break through thin soil, where forests of oak and hickory crowd the cleared patches, where springs bubble up from underground aquifers that never run dry. The land is rough, untamed, requiring brutal labour to transform into productive farmland. But it has one quality that Dakota lacked: reliability. Laura stands on their new property and surveys what $400 has purchased. The land slopes, making cultivation challenging. Rocks litter the surface, remnants of ancient geological upheaval. There is no house, no barn, no well, no fencing. They are starting quite literally from bare ground. But the trees are real, not saplings struggling to survive prairie wind, but mature hardwoods that provide timber, shade, and windbreak. And the climate, while hot in summer, does not bring the scouring heat that destroyed Dakota wheat. They pitch a tent near a spring. This temporary shelter, canvas walls, dirt floor, minimal protection from weather, becomes their home for the first months. Rose, now 7 years old, treats it as an adventure. She's lived in shanties, rented rooms, relatives' homes, and now a tent. Permanence is not a concept she's experienced, so the tent seems no worse than anything else. She helps gather firewood, carries water from the spring, learns to sleep despite the sounds of unfamiliar animals moving through the forest at night. Almanzo, leaning on his cane, begins the work of transforming wilderness into farm. His disability limits what he can do. He cannot swing an axe for hours, cannot dig post holes, cannot perform the sustained heavy labour that clearing requires. But he can plan, direct, and contribute what strength he possesses. They hire help when they can afford it, paying day labourers to clear timber and pull stumps. When they cannot afford help, Laura does the work herself. The labour required to establish Rocky Ridge Farm is staggering. Each tree must be felled, limbed, cut to manageable lengths, and either burned or milled for lumber. The stumps must be removed, a process involving chains, levers, and exhausting physical effort. The soil, once exposed, reveals its rocky nature. Stones must be picked, piled, and used for terracing or foundations, and all of this occurs while they simultaneously need to plant food crops, establish a garden, acquire livestock, and generate income. By winter of 1894, they have made minimal progress. A small one-room cabin replaces the tent. Rough construction, barely weatherproof but better than canvas. They have cleared perhaps 2 acres. They have planted nothing that will yield significant harvest. Their $100 in savings has dwindled to nearly nothing. And the Missouri winter, while milder than Dakota, is still cold enough to require constant fire and rationed food. But something fundamental has shifted. In Dakota, each disaster felt like active hostility. The land itself seemed to conspire against them. Here in Missouri, the challenges are different. The land is difficult but not capricious. Rain comes with reasonable predictability. The growing season is long, springs do not dry up. The soil, though rocky, supports diverse crops. This is not easy farming, but it is possible farming. Laura plants a garden in spring of 1895. Potatoes, beans, corn, squash, the staples that frontier families depend on. She also plants flowers, a small act of defiance against the purely utilitarian mindset that survival demands. The flowers serve no practical purpose. They do not feed the family or generate income, but they represent something Dakota never allowed, the luxury of beauty for its own sake. Almanzo plants apple trees. This decision reflects hard-won wisdom. The pamphlets promoting Missouri emphasized fruit farming, and unlike Dakota wheat, fruit trees do not require annual replanting. Once established, an orchard produces for decades. The investment is long-term. Apple trees take 5 to 7 years to begin bearing significant fruit, but the payoff, if they can survive long enough to see it, is substantial. The first years at Rocky Ridge Farm are characterized by grinding poverty that makes Dakota look almost prosperous by comparison. They have no cash reserves. Every expenditure must be carefully calculated against anticipated income. Laura takes in sewing when she can find customers, though Mansfield is small and most families do their own mending. Almanzo does odd jobs in town, like carpentry, equipment repair, anything his disability permits. Rose attends the Mansfield school, walking the mile from farm to town and back, her education continuing despite the family's precarious finances. But slowly, incrementally, the farm begins to produce. The garden yields vegetables that reduce their grocery expenses. Chickens provide eggs and occasional meat. A cow provides milk, butter, and cream. Laura's butter develops a reputation for quality, and she begins selling it in town for small but reliable income. The fruit trees, though years from maturity, grow steadily, their presence a promise of future prosperity. By 1897, 3 years after arriving in Missouri, the Wilders have achieved something they never managed in Dakota: stability. They are not wealthy. They are not even comfortable by middle-class standards, but they own their land outright, having paid off the mortgage. They have a house that, while small, is solid and weatherproof. They have income streams, however modest, and they have survived 3 years without a single catastrophic disaster. The contrast with Dakota is stark. In 4 years of Dakota farming, they experienced 4 disasters that destroyed everything. In 3 years of Missouri farming, they have experienced exactly 0 disasters. Just ordinary, manageable hardship of the kind that hard work can actually overcome. The early 1900s bring gradual improvement to Rocky Ridge Farm. The apple trees Almanzo planted in 1895 begin bearing fruit in 1901. The yields are modest initially, a few bushels per tree, but they represent the first significant cash crop the Wilders have successfully harvested since leaving Dakota. Almanzo sells the apples in Mansfield and to wholesalers who transport them to larger markets. The income, while not transformative, is substantial enough to reinvest in the farm. Laura expands her poultry operation. She begins with 12 hens and systematically grows the flock to over 200 by 1905. She develops expertise in chicken husbandry, studying breeds, experimenting with feeding strategies, and maintaining meticulous records of production. Her eggs become known in Mansfield for their quality, large, fresh, consistently available. She develops a regular customer base and eventually contracts with Mansfield grocers to supply eggs wholesale. The butter operation also expands. Laura purchases additional milk cows, which requires building a proper barn and establishing pastures. Almanzo, despite his disability, manages the carpentry work by hiring day labourers to perform the heavy lifting while he directs construction. The barn they build in 1903 is modest but functional, with proper stalls, a hayloft, and a cool cellar for butter storage. This represents the first permanent agricultural structure they have owned since the Dakota Homestead. Rose grows into adolescence during these years. She's bright, ambitious, and increasingly aware that Rocky Ridge Farm, while stable, offers limited opportunities for a young woman with intellectual aspirations. She excels in the Mansfield School, graduates at 15, and immediately begins seeking paths beyond rural Missouri. Her departure from home, first to Louisiana to finish high school at her Aunt Eliza Jane's encouragement, then to San Francisco to pursue work as a telegrapher, leaves Laura and Almanzo alone on the farm for the first time since Rose's birth in 1886. The farm continues to develop through the 1910s. Almanzo plants additional orchards, diversifying beyond apples to include peaches and pears. Laura establishes a more sophisticated poultry operation, adding turkeys and guinea fowl. They build a proper farmhouse, a 10-room structure that replaces the original cabin. This house, built incrementally over several years as money permits, represents the culmination of 2 decades of labour. It has modern conveniences that the Dakota shanties never possessed: proper windows with glass panes, plastered interior walls, a kitchen with a functional cook stove, bedrooms with real doors, but prosperity remains relative. The Wilders are comfortable by rural standards but not wealthy. They live frugally, reinvesting farm profits into improvements rather than luxuries. They have no automobile until 1922. They have no telephone until even later. Their lifestyle in 1915, after 20 years in Missouri, resembles what middle-class Dakota farmers enjoyed in 1885. They have finally achieved the stability that the Dakota boom promised but never delivered. Yet the ghost of Dakota never fully departs. Laura will later write that she kept a $100 bill hidden in her writing desk throughout these years, emergency funds in case of disaster. The trauma of losing everything in 1889 created a permanent anxiety about security, a need for financial buffers that no amount of Missouri prosperity could completely eliminate. She counts her chickens obsessively, monitors egg production with intensity that borders on compulsion, and maintains meticulous financial records that track every penny. These behaviours are not greed. They are the survival mechanisms of someone who has experienced total loss and never wants to be that vulnerable again. Almanzo's disability remains a constant presence. He walks with a cane for the rest of his life. By his 50s, the limp is pronounced enough that strangers notice immediately. He cannot perform prolonged physical labour without pain and exhaustion. The active farming he envisioned as a young man in Dakota, the commercial wheat operation that would make him prosperous, has been replaced by diversified small-scale agriculture that accommodates his limitations. He's not the farmer he intended to be, but he is alive, landowning and self-sufficient, which is more than many Dakota homesteaders achieved. The marriage, tested so severely in Dakota, has settled into comfortable partnership. Laura and Almanzo divide labour according to capability and preference. He manages the orchards and heavy construction. She manages the poultry, dairy and household. They make decisions jointly, consult on investments, and function as an economic unit. There is no evidence of serious marital discord during the Missouri years. The disasters that should have destroyed their marriage instead created a bond that ordinary prosperity could not break. By 1920, the Wilders are in their 50s. They have lived at Rocky Ridge Farm for 26 years, longer than Laura lived anywhere during her childhood, longer than Almanzo lived in Dakota. This is home in a way that no previous location ever was. The farm is paid off, the buildings are solid, the orchards are mature. They have achieved the frontier dream that Dakota promised but Missouri delivered. And then, in 1920, Laura begins writing. Initially, she produces articles for the Missouri Ruralist, a regional agricultural newspaper. She writes about poultry management, farm efficiency, rural life. The articles are competent, practical, and modestly popular. But they are not yet the work that will make her famous. That transformation is still a decade away, waiting for the Great Depression to arrive and destroy the financial security she has spent 30 years building. The irony is brutal. Laura will only tell the story of her Dakota disasters after Missouri prosperity collapses in the 1930s, forcing her to write for income. The Little House books, which will shape how millions understand the frontier, will be born from the same desperation that drove her from Dakota 40 years earlier. In 1930, Laura Ingalls Wilder is 63 years old. She has lived at Rocky Ridge Farm for 36 years. She has achieved the stability that Dakota denied her, and then the stock market crashes, the Great Depression begins, and the financial security she painstakingly built evaporates in months. The details of their financial losses remain somewhat unclear. Laura was private about such matters, but the impact is evident. Farm income drops precipitously as agricultural prices collapse. The savings they accumulated are diminished by bank failures and investment losses. Rose, who by 1930 has become a successful writer and journalist, provides financial assistance, but she herself faces economic pressure. The Wilders in their 60s face the prospect of poverty and old age, and so Laura begins writing the book that will become Little House in the Big Woods, published in 1932 when she is 65 years old. The decision to write a children's book about her Wisconsin childhood is both practical and psychological. Practically, the children's book market offers potential income. Psychologically, writing about her early childhood, before the Dakota disasters, before the losses, allows her to reclaim a narrative of frontier optimism. The success of Little House in the Big Woods is modest but encouraging. The publisher, Harper and Brothers, offers her a contract for additional books. Over the next 11 years, Laura produces 7 more novels: Farmer Boy, 1933, Little House on the Prairie, 1935, On the Banks of Plum Creek, 1937, By the Shores of Silver Lake, 1939, The Long Winter, 1940, Little Town on the Prairie, 1941, and These Happy Golden Years, 1943, which concludes with her marriage to Almanzo. The series ends there, deliberately, consciously. Laura chooses to conclude her narrative at the moment of her wedding, when she's 18 and Almanzo is 28, and the Dakota future stretches before them full of possibility. The books do not continue into the marriage years. They do not describe the crop failures, the diphtheria, the infant son's death, the house fire. They end on hope. But Laura did write about those years. Sometime around 1940, she composed a manuscript titled The First 4 Years, covering 1885 to 1889. The manuscript is raw, honest, devastating. It describes the hailstorms, the drought, the disability, the baby's death, the fire. It does not romanticize. It does not provide the comforting frontier mythology that the other books offer, and Laura never attempts to publish it during her lifetime. The manuscript remains in her desk drawer through the 1940s and 50s. She edits and revises the other books, corresponding with her editors and daughter Rose, who served as her uncredited co-writer and editor throughout the series. But the first 4 years stays hidden. When Laura dies in 1957 at age 90, the manuscript passes to Rose, who also chooses not to publish it. Only after Rose's death in 1968 does the manuscript finally reach publication in 1971, more than 80 years after the events it describes. The gap between the published books and the first 4 years reveals the myth-making process at work. The Little House series presents frontier life as difficult but ultimately rewarding. Families work hard, face challenges, and through perseverance achieve stability and happiness. The narrative arc is fundamentally optimistic. Hardship is temporary. Good people who work hard succeed. The American dream functions as promised. The first 4 years tells a different story. Hard work is not enough. Good people suffer disasters beyond their control. The frontier breaks as many families as it makes. The American dream sometimes burns to the ground, leaving nothing but ashes and an unnamed grave. Laura knew both stories were true. She chose to publish one and hide the other. This was not dishonesty. It was survival of a different kind. The literary marketplace of the 1930s wanted uplift, not trauma. Readers wanted to believe the frontier mythology, not confront its failures, and Laura needed the income that successful books provided. So she crafted a narrative that audiences would purchase and embrace. But she also preserved the truth. The manuscript in her desk drawer served as witness to what actually happened. She did not destroy it. She did not pretend the disasters never occurred. She simply chose not to share them publicly while she was alive to face the questions, the sympathy, the uncomfortable conversations about the son no one knew existed, and the dreams that burned in Dakota. The Little House books made Laura famous. They provided financial security in her final years. They shaped how generations of Americans understood frontier history. Children who read the books grew up believing in a version of westward expansion that emphasized courage, family, and perseverance. The books became foundational texts in American children's literature, adapted for television in the 1970s and still in print nearly a century after their initial publication. But they are not documentaries. They are literature, crafted narratives that select, shape, and interpret experience according to authorial purpose. Laura was not a historian attempting objective accuracy. She was a storyteller, choosing what to reveal and what to conceal. The Little House series is her mythology, her reimagining of the frontier in ways that made it bearable to remember and profitable to share. The irony is that the first 4 years, unpublished during her lifetime, may be her most important work. It stands as a counter-narrative to the mythology, a reminder that the frontier was often brutal, that disasters happened, that families suffered in ways that optimistic narratives erase. It is the book that almost no one read during her lifetime, but that scholars now recognize as essential to understanding both Laura's life and the broader history of American westward expansion. Almanzo dies in 1949 at age 92. He lived with his disability for 61 years, longer than many people live entire lives. He outlived most of his siblings, most of the Dakota homesteaders he knew, and nearly all his horses. He saw the frontier close, the automobile replace horses, the telephone connect remote farms, and the world transform beyond anything he could have imagined standing in that Dakota wheat field in 1886. Laura lives another 8 years after Almanzo's death. She spends her final years at Rocky Ridge Farm, cared for by neighbours and friends, still writing letters to fans who grew up reading her books. She dies on February 10th, 1957, 3 days after her 90th birthday. She's buried beside Almanzo in the Mansfield Cemetery. The Dakota son, who died at 27 days, remains buried somewhere in De Smet, his grave location lost to time, his name uncertain, his existence known only to those who read the manuscript Laura kept hidden for decades. He is not buried beside his parents. He is not commemorated, but he is remembered, not in the mythology of Little House, but in the truth that Laura finally, reluctantly set down on paper and locked away. The 4 disasters that nearly destroyed Laura and Almanzo's marriage between 1885 and 1889 shaped everything that followed. They survived not because the frontier rewarded hard work. Dakota proved that was a lie, but because they chose each other over surrender, Missouri over Dakota, and 36 years of patient rebuilding over the dramatic frontier narrative the books would later celebrate. The myth of the Little House series is beautiful. The truth of the first 4 years is brutal. Both are part of Laura Ingalls Wilder's legacy, and both tell us something essential about what the American frontier actually was. A place where some families found prosperity, many families found disaster, and one woman spent 50 years deciding which story to tell. The Little House books sold modestly during Laura's lifetime. By the time of her death in 1957, they had sold approximately 3 million copies, respectable for children's literature but not extraordinary. The books were popular among young readers, recommended by librarians, and taught in some schools. But they were not yet the cultural phenomenon they would become. That transformation began in the 1960s and exploded in the 1970s with the NBC television adaptation. On September 16, 1974, Little House on the Prairie premiered on American television, produced by Ed Friendly and Michael Landon, with Landon starring as Charles Ingalls. The show would run for 9 seasons, 204 episodes, reaching tens of millions of viewers weekly. The television series took extraordinary liberties with Laura's books, which themselves had taken extraordinary liberties with Laura's life. The NBC show invented plotlines wholesale, Charles Ingalls saving towns from disasters, Laura befriending children who never existed, Almanzo recovering fully from paralysis through sheer determination and Laura's love. The show added characters, changed timelines, and created an entire fictional universe, loosely inspired by Laura's childhood, but bearing minimal resemblance to documented history. Most significantly, the show ended its initial run in 1983 without ever depicting the 4 disasters. The series concluded with specials and reunion movies that showed the Ingalls and Wilder families prospering, their hardships temporary and overcome. Almanzo, played by Dean Butler, walked without a cane. The infant son who died in 1889 did not exist in the show's universe. The house fire, the diphtheria, the crop failures, all either absent or sanitized beyond recognition. Millions of Americans who grew up watching Little House on the Prairie formed their understanding of frontier life from a television show that invented most of its content. They learned that pioneers faced challenges but overcame them through hard work and family love. They learned that the frontier rewarded virtue. They learned that America's westward expansion was fundamentally good. Difficult, yes, but ultimately redemptive. This mythology served a purpose. The 1970s were a turbulent decade in American history. Watergate, Vietnam, economic stagflation, energy crises, social upheaval. Little House offered a nostalgic vision of an America where values were clear, families were strong, and good people prospered. The show provided comfort. And comfort was what audiences sought. But comfort came at the cost of truth. The real Laura Ingalls Wilder, the woman who buried an infant son, who watched her husband become permanently disabled, who stood in the ruins of a burned house with nothing, disappeared behind the television character. The real Almanzo Wilder, who walked with a cane for 61 years, whose disability shaped every day of his adult life, was replaced by Dean Butler's able-bodied portrayal of gradual, triumphant recovery. And the real story of frontier settlement, where 80 to 90% of homesteaders failed, where disease killed without mercy, where fires destroyed everything, where the land itself defeated most who tried to farm it, was replaced by a mythology of inevitable success. The Little House books themselves were already mythologized versions of Laura's life. She chose to end the series with These Happy Golden Years, which concludes with her marriage to Almanzo. The narrative stops at the moment of hope, before the disasters. Readers who completed the series learned nothing about diphtheria, infant death, house fires, or forced migration. They learned that Laura's story was one of childhood challenges overcome and adult happiness achieved. The first 4 years, published 14 years after Laura's death, complicated that narrative. But by 1971, when the manuscript finally reached print, the Little House mythology was already established. The first 4 years was read by scholars and devoted fans, but did not penetrate popular consciousness the way the earlier books had. Most readers never encountered it. The result was a cultural understanding of the American frontier built on selective memory and deliberate omission. School curricula taught the Little House books as windows into pioneer life. Teachers assigned projects building log cabins and churning butter, replicating the domestic activities Laura described. Children dressed as Laura and Mary for Halloween and book reports. The frontier became a place of wholesome family values and pioneer virtues. What disappeared was the structural violence of frontier settlement, the displacement of indigenous peoples from land recently taken by military force, the environmental destruction of prairie ecosystems, the economic exploitation of settlers by railroad companies and land speculators, the grinding poverty that broke most families, the disease and death that frontier medicine could not prevent, the permanent disabilities that frontier conditions created. Also disappeared were the women whose stories never got told because they did not survive to write them. Laura's survival was not typical, it was exceptional. Most women who buried infant children did not live to age 90. Most families struck by 4 disasters within 2 years did not rebuild. Most disabled farmers did not recover enough to establish successful orchards. The Wilders succeeded eventually, but their success was the exception that proved the rule. The frontier killed more dreams than it fulfilled. By the time Little House on the Prairie ended its television run in 1983, 3 generations of Americans had learned a version of frontier history that emphasized triumph and concealed catastrophe. The show had become one of the most successful series in television history. Laura Ingalls Wilder had become a household name, and the 4 disasters that nearly destroyed her had been erased from popular memory. The mythology was complete, and it was almost entirely false. The scholarly reassessment of Laura Ingalls. Wilder began quietly in the 1990s and exploded into public consciousness in 2017 with the publication of Caroline Fraser's Prairie Fires, The American Dreams of Laura Ingalls Wilder. Fraser's biography, which won the Pulitzer Prize, was the first comprehensive scholarly treatment of Laura's entire life that combined rigorous archival research with unflinching analysis of the gap between Laura's books and historical reality. Fraser documented the 4 disasters in detail, using land records, newspaper accounts, medical histories, and Laura's own unpublished manuscripts to reconstruct what actually happened between 1885 and 1889. The book revealed the extent to which Laura had mythologized her own experience. Fraser showed that Laura's narrative choices, ending the series before the disasters, minimizing Almanzo's disability, erasing the infant son's existence, were deliberate acts of literary construction, not innocent omissions. Laura was crafting a story that would sell, that would provide hope to Depression-era readers, that would affirm American mythology rather than challenge it. Fraser also addressed what earlier biographers had largely avoided, the racist content in Laura's books. The portrayal of indigenous peoples as obstacles to settlement, the use of racial slurs, the assumption that white settlement was morally justified, all of this reflected Laura's own beliefs and the ideology of her era. But publication of these attitudes in children's books throughout the 20th century had normalized settler colonial mythology for generations of young readers. The response to Prairie Fires was polarized. Scholars praised its research and honesty. Devoted Little House fans felt betrayed, arguing that Fraser was attacking a beloved American icon. The debate revealed how deeply the Little House mythology had penetrated American culture. For many readers, Laura was not a historical figure subject to scholarly analysis. She was a cherished symbol of American values, and criticizing her felt like attacking America itself. The controversy intensified in 2018 when the Association for Library Service to Children voted to remove Laura Ingalls Wilder's name from its major children's literature award. The award, established in 1954 and named for Wilder in recognition of her contribution to children's literature, was renamed the Children's Literature Legacy Award. The ALSC cited anti-native and anti-black sentiments in her work as inconsistent with the award's values. The decision triggered fierce debate. Supporters argue that institutions must reckon with historical figures' racism rather than continue honouring names associated with harmful ideologies. Critics argue that removing Wilder's name was presentism, judging historical figures by contemporary standards, and that her literary contribution should be honoured despite her flaws. But the debate largely missed the deeper point that Fraser and other scholars were making. The issue was not simply that Laura held racist beliefs typical of her era. The issue was that her books had been used for a century to teach American children a fundamentally false narrative about westward expansion, a narrative that erased indigenous dispossession, romanticised settler colonialism, and presented frontier hardship as character building rather than as the consequence of failed government policy and environmental unsuitability. The four disasters, properly understood, revealed this structural failure. The Wilders didn't fail because they lacked virtue or work ethic. They failed because the Homestead Act incentivized settlement of land that could not sustain agriculture, because the government provided no support when crops failed, because frontier medical infrastructure could not treat disease, because there was no social safety net when disaster struck. The frontier mythology blamed individuals for structural problems and credited individuals for what was actually luck. Other scholarly works contributed to this reassessment. Johnny Ardor Miller's Becoming Laura Ingalls Wilder, 1998, was the first serious scholarly biography, examining Laura's transformation from frontier survivor to author. Pamela Smith Hill's work on Pioneer Girl, Laura's original autobiography manuscript, revealed how much editorial revision shaped the published books, including Rose Wilder Lane's extensive uncredited editing and rewriting. Anita Claire Fellman's Little House Long Shadow, 2008, analysed the cultural impact of the Little House series, documenting how the books shaped American historical memory and identity. Fellman showed that the Little House books functioned as civic mythology, teaching children what it meant to be American by presenting a curated version of the past that affirmed contemporary values. The cumulative effect of this scholarship was to separate Laura Ingalls Wilder, the historical person, from Little House, the cultural phenomenon. The woman who survived 4 disasters, who rebuilt her life in Missouri, who wrote books out of financial desperation during the Great Depression, was a complex human being with talents and flaws. The cultural icon, the symbol of pioneer virtue and American resilience, was a construction built by Laura herself, polished by her daughter Rose, amplified by publishers, and distorted beyond recognition by television producers. Understanding this distinction does not diminish Laura's literary achievement. The Little House books remain well-crafted children's literature that have brought pleasure to millions of readers. But recognizing them as literature rather than documentary history allows for honest engagement with what the frontier actually was, a place of displacement, environmental destruction, economic exploitation, and human suffering, where some families survived and most did not, and where survival often depended on luck as much as virtue. The scholars who told this truth faced resistance because mythology is always more comforting than history, but the truth matters. Not because it makes heroes into villains, but because understanding what actually happened is the only foundation for understanding who we are. For 70 years, from the publication of These Happy Golden Years in 1943 until the widespread scholarly reassessment, beginning in the 2000s, American popular culture presented the Laura Ingalls Wilder story as one of frontier triumph. Millions of children read the books. Millions more watched the television show. Schools built curricula around pioneer life using Little House as primary text. Museums and historic sites dedicated to the Ingalls and Wilder families drew tourists seeking connection to an imagined past. What was the cost of this mythology? What did we lose by erasing the 4 disasters from our cultural memory? First, we lost an honest reckoning with the human cost of westward expansion. The frontier was not empty land waiting for industrious settlers. It was contested territory, recently cleared of indigenous peoples through military violence and treaty violations. The Dakota territory where Laura and Almanzo farmed had been Lakota land until the 1860s and 70s. The empty prairie Laura described in her books was empty, because the US government had forcibly removed the people who lived there. By presenting the frontier as a place where hard work led to success, the Little House mythology erased this displacement. Children who grew up reading the books learned that pioneers were heroes settling wilderness, not that pioneers were participants in a colonial project that destroyed existing communities and ways of life. The mythology made westward expansion seem natural and inevitable rather than violent and contested. Second, we lost an understanding of how structural conditions, not individual virtue, determined frontier outcomes. The Wilders failed in Dakota not because they lacked character, but because the government incentivized settlement of marginal agricultural land during a temporarily wet period, then provided no support when normal climate patterns returned. 80 to 90% of homesteaders failed for the same reason. The system was designed to fail. But the Little House mythology taught that success or failure was a matter of personal determination. This ideology serves powerful interests. If failure is personal rather than structural, then government intervention is unnecessary, and individuals bear sole responsibility for their poverty. The mythology justified a political economy that privatized profit and socialized loss, that celebrated individual success stories while ignoring systemic failure. Third, we lost the stories of disability, infant mortality, and permanent loss. Almanzo's paralysis was not temporary setback overcome through determination. It was permanent disability that shaped every day of his remaining 61 years. The unnamed infant son who died at 27 days was not an unfortunate detail to be glossed over. He was a real child whose brief life and death mattered. Laura's trauma from experiencing 4 disasters in 2 years was not character building. It was genuine psychological injury that she carried for the rest of her 90 years. By erasing these stories, the mythology presented a sanitized version of frontier life, where hardship was always temporary and loss was always redeemed. This did not comfort people facing similar experiences, it alienated them. Parents who buried children could not find their grief reflected in the Little House books. People living with disability saw no representation of permanent limitation. Families experiencing cascading disasters found no acknowledgement that sometimes hard work is not enough. The cost of the mythology was empathy. By insisting that frontier stories must be uplifting, we deprived ourselves of the connection that comes from honest shared experience. Fourth, we lost the opportunity to understand how historical trauma shapes narrative. Laura's decision to end her book series before the disasters to keep the first 4 years unpublished during her lifetime, to erase her infant son from her public biography, these were not moral failures. They were the responses of a trauma survivor who spent 50 years deciding what she could bear to share. Understanding this transforms how we read the Little House books. They are not objective history. They are one woman's attempt to make meaning from catastrophe, to find redemption in memory, to construct a narrative of her life that she could live with. They are testimony, partial, shaped by pain, but testimony nonetheless. If we had recognized this earlier, we might have approached the books with more nuance. We might have taught children that all historical narratives are constructed, that all memoirs are selective, that understanding the past requires asking what has been left out and why. We might have used Laura's story to develop critical thinking about how historical memory is formed rather than absorbing her mythology uncritically. Fifth, we lost the chance to reckon with how gender-shaped frontier experience. Laura's story is exceptional because she survived to write it. Most frontier women's experiences are lost because they did not survive or did not have the time, education, or opportunity to record their stories. The women who died in childbirth, who buried multiple children, who worked themselves to death before 40, their stories disappeared. The Little House mythology, by presenting Laura as representative, actually obscured how extraordinary her survival was. She lived to 90. She retained her literary faculties throughout old age. She had a daughter who became a successful writer and could support her. She settled in Missouri, where climate and soil allowed agricultural success impossible in Dakota. She was lucky in ways that most frontier women were not. Recognizing this does not diminish Laura's achievement. It contextualizes it. Her survival and literary success were triumphs precisely because they were so unlikely. But mythologizing her story as typical erased the countless women whose frontier experience ended in early death, permanent disability, or anonymous poverty. Finally, we lost the opportunity to learn from historical failure. The Dakota homesteading experiment failed catastrophically. The government incentivized settlement of land that could not sustainably support agriculture. When settlers failed, there was no support system. They simply lost everything and were forced to migrate or starve. This was predictable and predicted. Climate data suggested Dakota was marginal for wheat. Economic analysts warned that land speculation was unsustainable. But the government proceeded anyway because westward expansion served ideological and economic interests regardless of human cost. If we had honestly reckoned with this failure, if the Little House books and television show had depicted the Dakota disasters as consequences of bad policy rather than individual misfortune, we might have learned something applicable to contemporary challenges. We might recognize that when government incentivizes behavior without providing support for inevitable failures, people suffer. We might understand that climate and environment impose real constraints that optimism cannot overcome. We might develop humility about the limits of human control over natural systems. Instead, the mythology taught us that determination conquers all obstacles, that failure is always personal, that the frontier was won through individual virtue rather than through government subsidy, military violence and environmental exploitation. These lessons are false, and they have shaped American political culture for a century. The silence about Laura's 4 disasters cost us the truth, and the truth would have served us better than the myth. Scholars often debate what resilience means when applied to historical trauma. Did Laura and Almanzo Wilder demonstrate resilience by surviving 4 disasters, or did they simply endure because endurance was the only available option? The question matters because resilience has become a modern virtue, a quality we celebrate in individuals and demand of communities. We speak of resilient cities and resilient economies and resilient families as if the capacity to withstand catastrophe were primarily a matter of character rather than circumstance. The Wilder story, properly understood, exposes this mythology. Laura and Almanzo did not thrive through the 4 disasters. They disintegrated. Financially, from hopeful newlyweds with 320 acres and farming equipment to homeless debtors with a disabled breadwinner and no viable income source. Physically, Almanzo's permanent paralysis reduced his labour capacity by at least 50%, creating limitations that no amount of determination could overcome. Emotionally, the infant son's death created trauma so profound that Laura erased him from her public narrative for 50 years. This was not triumph, this was damage. What they did do, and what actually constitutes survival rather than resilience, was make a series of increasingly desperate choices that eventually led to circumstances where rebuilding became possible. They left Dakota not because they were strong, but because staying would have killed them. They tried Florida not because they believed in climate therapy, but because they were grasping at any possibility of recovery. They returned to Dismet and worked menial jobs not because they valued hard work, but because they needed to eat. And finally, in July of 1894, they loaded a wagon with everything they still owned, which was almost nothing, and left South Dakota forever. But the decision to leave for Missouri was not resilience. It was recognition that the frontier dream was dead, that Dakota had defeated them, and that survival required abandoning the identity they had built as homesteaders. The modern fetishization of resilience obscures this reality. We want stories where people overcome adversity through inner strength. We want to believe that character determines outcomes. We want survivors to be heroes. But most survivors are simply people who had slightly better luck, or slightly more resources, or slightly different circumstances that allowed them to continue existing when others did not. Laura and Almanzo survived 4 disasters not because they were exceptionally resilient, but because they were exceptionally fortunate in narrow, specific ways. They had extended family who could provide temporary shelter. They had sheep to sell for relocation capital. They had each other, a functional partnership where disability and trauma did not destroy the marriage. And they had, eventually, the option to leave for Missouri, where environmental conditions were genuinely more forgiving than Dakota. Thousands of other frontier families faced similar disasters and did not survive. They died of diphtheria. Their marriages collapsed under the weight of grief and disability. They lost their land to foreclosure and disappeared into historical anonymity. The Wilders survived, but that survival was contingent and fragile, not inevitable and heroic. Understanding this distinction matters because it changes how we think about contemporary crises. When families face cascading disasters today, medical debt from chronic illness, job loss during economic recession, housing insecurity during climate catastrophe, we often blame them for lacking resilience. We suggest that if they simply tried harder, planned better, demonstrated more grit, they would overcome their circumstances. The Wilder story reveals how false this is. Laura and Almanzo tried as hard as any human beings could reasonably try. They worked constantly. They planned carefully. They demonstrated extraordinary grit. And they still lost everything. What saved them was not their character. It was the specific structural supports they accessed and the specific environmental conditions of Missouri versus Dakota. If we lionize resilience, we obscure the role of systems, structures, and sheer random chance in determining outcomes. We make failure seem like a personal moral flaw rather than a predictable consequence of inadequate support during crisis. And we let ourselves off the hook for creating societies where people must be extraordinarily resilient just to survive ordinary catastrophes. Laura Ingalls. Wilder's literary mythology celebrates resilience. Her unpublished manuscript, The First 4 Years, documents something more honest. The grinding reality of survival, where strength is often just the absence of alternatives, where recovery takes decades, and where trauma never fully heals but simply becomes part of who you are. The difference between these two narratives is the difference between mythology and history. Mythology tells us what we want to believe about ourselves. History tells us what actually happened. And what actually happened to Laura and Almanzo between 1885 and 1889 was not a story of resilience triumphing over adversity. It was a story of two people who were broken by circumstances beyond their control, who made desperate choices to stay alive, who were eventually fortunate enough to find a place where the land did not actively try to kill them, and who spent the next 30 years slowly, painfully rebuilding something that resembled stability. That story is less inspiring than the mythology, but it is more true. And the truth, however uncomfortable, serves us better than the myth. Because the truth tells us that when systems fail people, we cannot simply demand that people be more resilient. We must build better systems. We must create safety nets. We must recognize that survival is not primarily a matter of character. It is a matter of circumstance, structure, and collective responsibility. Laura Ingalls. Wilder gave us a beautiful myth, but she also left us, hidden in her desk drawer for decades, a more difficult truth. Both are part of her legacy. But only one of them can teach us how to actually help people survive catastrophe. Every act of remembering is also an act of forgetting. When Laura Ingalls Wilder sat down in the 1930s to write about her childhood and adolescence, she made thousands of tiny decisions about what to include and what to exclude. Each decision shaped not only her personal narrative, but also how millions of Americans would understand frontier history. She chose to remember the little house in the big woods, warm and secure. She chose to forget the houses that burned or were abandoned. She chose to remember Pa's fiddle and Ma's patience. She chose to forget the structural violence of settler colonialism that made their settlement possible. She chose to remember the happiness of her wedding day. She chose to forget the 4 disasters that nearly destroyed her immediately afterward. These were not lies, they were selections, and selections always reveal what the selector values, fears, or cannot bear to confront. What Laura valued was clear: family bonds, hard work, pioneer optimism, American exceptionalism. What she feared was equally clear: that her story might not matter if it was too bleak, that publishers would not buy darkness, that readers wanted inspiration rather than trauma. And what she could not bear to confront, the infant son's death, the extent of Almanzo's disability, the depth of her own despair, she simply left out. The result was a narrative that shaped American identity for a century. Children who read the Little House books learned that pioneers were brave, that hard work was rewarded, that families stayed together through adversity, and that the frontier was a place where American values were forged. They did not learn that 80 to 90% of homesteaders failed. They did not learn that indigenous peoples were violently displaced to create the empty prairie. They did not learn that chronic illness, infant mortality, and environmental catastrophe killed frontier dreams as often as they fulfilled them. This selective memory became cultural memory. The Little House books were taught in schools, adapted for television, referenced in political speeches, and held up as evidence of what America was and what Americans could be. The mythology was so powerful that even when scholars began documenting the historical inaccuracies, the romanticization of poverty, the erasure of racism, the omission of disasters, the mythology persisted. Because mythology serves a function that history cannot. Mythology provides meaning. It tells us who we are supposed to be. It offers models of behavior and virtue. It creates shared identity across generations. History, by contrast, is messy and contradictory and often meaningless. History tells us that bad things happen to good people for no reason, that hard work often fails, that virtue is not rewarded, and that most human suffering produces no redemptive meaning whatsoever. We prefer mythology. We need mythology. But mythology unexamined becomes dangerous because it shapes expectations, policies, and judgments that affect real people's lives. When Americans today resist social safety nets, they often invoke frontier mythology. Our ancestors survived without government help, so why can't people today just work harder? When politicians argue against disaster relief, they reference pioneer grit. Laura Ingalls Wilder rebuilt after losing everything, so why can't flood victims simply demonstrate more resilience? When communities blame individuals for poverty, they draw on the assumption that the frontier rewarded virtue and punished laziness, ignoring that the frontier actually rewarded luck and punished anyone unlucky enough to homestead in drought zones. The cost of unchallenged mythology is policy that harms people. If we believe the frontier succeeded because of individual character, we won't invest in structural supports. If we believe Laura and Almanzo overcame disasters through determination alone, we won't recognize that they actually survived through family wealth, Almanzo's parents, marketable assets, the sheep flock, and geographic mobility, the ability to relocate multiple times. If we believe the Little House story is universal rather than exceptional, we won't acknowledge that most frontier families did not get happy endings. Laura's choice to mythologize rather than document was understandable. She was writing during the Great Depression, when audiences desperately needed hope. She was a product of her era's values and limitations. She was protecting her own trauma by controlling how it was remembered. None of this makes her dishonest. It makes her human. But our choice, in the 21st century, with access to archival research, scholarly analysis, and historical hindsight, to continue privileging mythology over history is less defensible. We know better. We have the documents. We understand structural inequality, environmental determinism, and systemic failure in ways Laura's generation did not. We can honour Laura Ingalls Wilder's literary achievement while also recognising its limitations. We can appreciate the Little House books as cultural artefacts without treating them as historical documentation. We can value the comfort and inspiration millions of readers have found in Laura's mythology, while also insisting that we teach a more complete, more honest version of frontier history. This is not cancelling Laura Ingalls Wilder. This is contexting her. This is reading her work with the sophistication it deserves as literature shaped by trauma, ideology, and market pressures, not as transparent windows into the past. The stories we inherit shape the futures we imagine. If we inherit only mythology, we imagine futures where individual resilience solves structural problems. If we inherit history, messy, painful, honest history, we imagine futures where we build systems that prevent cascading disasters from destroying families in the first place. Laura gave us both options, the mythology she published and the history she kept hidden. The question is which story we choose to pass forward, and that choice will determine not only how we remember the past, but how we shape the future. On July 17th, 1894, Laura Ingalls Wilder, Almanzo Wilder, and their 7-year-old daughter Rose departed De Smet, South Dakota for the final time. They travelled in a covered wagon pulled by horses, carrying everything they owned: clothing, cooking equipment, a few pieces of furniture, Almanzo's tools, and $100 in cash, the amount they had saved through 2 years of menial labour in the town they once hoped to call home. The journey would cover approximately 650 miles, taking roughly 6 weeks to complete. They would travel south and east through South Dakota into Nebraska, then into Kansas, and finally into Missouri. The route was deliberate. They were following promotional materials Laura had obtained advertising the Ozark region as the land of the big red apple, a place where climate was moderate, land was affordable, and fruit farming offered reliable income. This was not the first time Laura and Almanzo had left De Smet hoping for recovery. They had tried Spring Valley, Minnesota in 1890. They had tried Westville, Florida in 1891. Both experiments had failed. Minnesota was temporary refuge, not permanent solution, and Florida had been a humid nightmare that made Almanzo's health worse rather than better. This departure was different because it was final. They were not fleeing disaster in panic. They were making a calculated decision based on research, savings, and cold assessment of where they had failed and why. The wagon journey itself was grueling but manageable. Rose, at 7, was old enough to walk when the terrain was rough, to help with camp setup, to entertain herself during long hours of travel. Almanzo, despite his disability, could drive. Managing reins required upper body strength and judgment, not the leg function he had lost. Laura cooked over campfires, washed clothes in streams, and kept meticulous track of their remaining money, knowing that every dollar spent on the road was a dollar they would not have for land purchase. They passed through landscapes that shifted gradually from prairie to mixed woodland. They saw other families travelling, some heading west with optimism, others heading east in defeat, a constant migration that defined the late 19th century. They camped near towns when possible, buying supplies and occasionally earning a few dollars through odd jobs. They avoided the scrutiny that accompanied obvious poverty by keeping their wagon neat and their clothing clean. But this journey was not about the physical distance they covered. It was about the psychological distance they were creating between themselves and the Dakota disasters. Every mile south was a mile away from the grave of their infant son. Every mile east was a mile away from the burned foundations of their homes. Every mile toward Missouri was a mile away from the crop failures, the diphtheria epidemic, the bankruptcy, the humiliation of having to ask Laura's parents for help despite being married adults. Rose, too young to fully understand what her parents were fleeing, would later write about this journey as an adventure, the romance of covered wagon travel, the excitement of seeing new places, the anticipation of a farm where apples grew heavy on the trees. But for Laura and Almanzo, the journey was something darker and more necessary. Exile disguised as migration, retreat disguised as adventure, defeat disguised as fresh start. They arrived in Mansfield, Missouri on August 30th, 1894. The town was small but established. Approximately 400 residents, brick buildings, a functioning railroad depot. They checked into the Mansfield Hotel temporarily while they searched for land. Within days, they identified the property that would become Rocky Ridge Farm, 40 acres of rough timbered hill country, 1 mile from town, selling for $400. They made the purchase on September 2nd with their $100 down payment and an agreement to pay the remaining $300 over time. This transaction, recorded in Wright County land records, marked the official beginning of their Missouri lives. But what is not recorded, what cannot be recorded in deeds and purchase agreements, is what that 40 acres meant psychologically. It meant they had survived, not thrived, not overcome, not triumphed, but survived. 9 years after their wedding in Desmet, they finally owned land again. Not 320 acres of Dakota Prairie where wheat grew tall in wet years and burned in drought. 40 acres of Ozark Hill country that required brutal labour to clear but would eventually support fruit trees that produced regardless of annual rainfall patterns. This is where the story of the 4 disasters actually ends. Not in 1889 when the house burned, not in 1890 when they fled to Minnesota, not even in 1892 when they returned to Desmet and began rebuilding. The story ends on September 2nd, 1894, when they purchased land with money they had earned through their own labour, in a place they had chosen through their own research, and began building a life that was genuinely theirs rather than a life shaped by disaster and reaction to disaster. Laura was 27 years old. Almanzo was 37. They had been married 9 years. They had buried one child and raised another. They had lost 2 homes to fire, multiple crops to weather, and Almanzo's health to disease. They had been displaced 3 times. They had worked dozens of odd jobs. They had saved $100 through discipline that bordered on obsession, and they had finally reached a place where the land would not kill them. But the trauma did not end on September the 2nd, 1894. Trauma does not end when circumstances improve. It persists, it shapes, it influences every decision and every relationship and every memory. For the next 60 years, until Laura's death in 1957, she would carry the infant son's death, the house fires, the Dakota failures. She would write 8 books that ended before the disasters. She would write 1 manuscript that addressed the disasters, but never publish it during her lifetime. She would become famous for mythology and keep the history locked in her desk. And in doing so, she would give us both. The story she told and the story she couldn't tell. The myth that shaped American identity and the truth that challenges it. The literary legacy that brought comfort to millions, and the hidden manuscript that reveals how much that comfort cost. The 4 disasters that nearly destroyed Laura and Almanzo Wilder's marriage between 1885 and 1889 were not the end of their story. They were the buried foundation of everything that came after. The Missouri prosperity, the literary career, the American legend. Understanding those disasters does not diminish Laura's achievement, it deepens it. Because survival is not about overcoming trauma, it is about learning to carry it. And Laura Ingalls Wilder carried hers for 90 years, transforming pain into prose, loss into legend, and a wagon journey away from Dakota into one of the most powerful origin stories in American literature. But the question remains, what actually happened on that 45-day wagon journey from Desmet to Mansfield? What did Laura see, feel, and understand as she watched the Dakota Prairie disappear behind her forever? What conversations did she and Almanzo have around those campfires, knowing they were leaving their son's grave hundreds of miles behind? And how did that journey, not just the destination, but the journey itself, transform them from broken Dakota homesteaders into the founders of Rocky Ridge Farm? That story has never been fully told. Until now.